Greetings, brave souls, and welcome to the shadowed corridors of Nocturnal Nightmares TV, where the rain doesn't just fall, it listens. Tonight, we're unraveling tales so chilling, even the thunder hesitates to roar. As the storm murmurs secrets, we'll venture into true horrors that squirm in the dark corners of reality. If your spine tingles, pledge your courage. Smash subscribe and let the algorithm know you dare to linger here. Drop a drop of blood in the comments if you're watching from a place the night has already claimed. Your support fuels our descent into the abyss. Now, steady your pulse, lock your screen's glow, and let the whispers of these stories crawl into your ears. The darkness is listening. Are you? The bridge of whispers. The salt-laced air bit at my exposed cheeks as I parked my battered Corolla at the bridge's entrance. Dawn was bleeding across the horizon, painting the steel structure in hues of violet and bruised orange. The Bridge of Whispers, they called it. Suicide Bridge, others muttered under their breath. Local legend claimed the bridge spoke to those on the edge, coaxing them over. Jumpers often cited the voice, that insidious whisper, as the final push. I, a cynic by trade and a journalist by profession, was here to debunk it, to write the definitive piece that exposed the whispers as nothing more than the desperate delusions of broken minds. I hoisted my recording equipment, a sensitive parabolic microphone, and a notepad thick with scientific studies about the bridge's acoustics, and walked onto the span. The wind howled, as expected. The steel groaned under my feet, equally predictable. I adjusted the microphone, recording the ambient noise. Just wind, traffic, the mournful cries of gulls circling overhead. Nothing supernatural. Nothing whispering sweet nothings of oblivion. I walked further, stopping at the point where the most jumpers were reported to have met their end. The railing was cold and slick beneath my gloved hand. I leaned over, peering down at the churning water far below. The waves crashed against the jagged rocks, a relentless, unforgiving rhythm. And then I heard it, not a shout, not a scream, not the roar of the wind, but a soft, sibilant murmur, right in my ear, a sound woven into the wind itself, a phantom voice that seemed to emanate from the very steel I gripped. Jump! The word was barely audible, a breath against my skin, yet it resonated within me with the force of a physical blow. My knees went weak. My palms turned clammy. The world tilted on its axis. Jump, it whispered again, a silken promise of release. No more pain, no more struggle, just let go. An image flashed in my mind. The endless, aching disappointment I felt with my career, my fractured family, the gnawing emptiness within me. The voice seemed to know. It knew everything. It offered a solution, a way out. For a moment, a terrifying, alluring moment, I understood. I understood the allure of the void, the siren call of the deep. The railing felt less like a barrier and more like a starting block. My fingers loosened, my muscles tensed. I could almost feel the wind rushing past me, the exhilarating plunge into nothingness. Then, with a jolt, I snapped back. The rational part of my brain, the part that clung to logic and reason, screamed in protest. I stumbled backward, away from the railing, clutching my chest, gasping for air. The whisper was gone, replaced by the familiar howl of the wind. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold. What had just happened? Was it the exhaustion, the lack of sleep, the intense focus on the project? Or was it something more? I fumbled for my notepad, my hands trembling. How could I explain this? How could I write a story that didn't sound like the ravings of a lunatic? I looked back at the railing at that spot. It looked the same, cold and indifferent. But now I saw it differently. I saw it not as a silent object, but as a conduit, a vessel for something dark and powerful. I spent the next hour recording the bridge, analyzing the data, searching for any anomaly, any explanation. The microphone picked up nothing unusual, only the wind, the traffic, the gulls. But I knew I had heard it. I had felt it. The Bridge of Whispers was real. The article I eventually wrote wasn't the debunking piece I had envisioned. It was a confession, a raw and honest account of my experience. I wrote about the whisper, the sudden, overwhelming desire to jump, the terrifying allure of oblivion. I called the article The Bridge Listens, because that, I realized, was the truth of it. The bridge didn't just whisper, it listened. It listened to the pain, the despair, the unspoken longings of those who came to its edge. It amplified those feelings, magnifying them until they became unbearable. I didn't have a scientific explanation. I didn't claim to understand the phenomenon. But I hoped with my article to offer a warning to those who might be drawn to the Bridge of Whispers, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a choice, and that sometimes the voices in our heads are not our own. Sometimes they are echoes of the abyss, and the abyss, I learned, can whisper louder than we think. The neighbor's party. The scent of rosemary and something acrid hung heavy in the air. A bizarre olfactory cocktail that permeated the neighborhood every Friday night. The Davidsons, our new neighbors, were enthusiastic hosts. Each week, a string of cars lined the street. Music drifted from their meticulously manicured lawn, and laughter, perhaps a little too boisterous, echoed until late. They hosted dinner parties everyone knew, but nobody seemed to leave. Ever. At least that's what I thought. Mrs. Henderson, bless her gossipy soul, had confirmed it. She'd seen cars arrive, but never depart. The Davidsons were charming, too charming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Tonight, curiosity overwhelmed me. Fueled by a potent mix of anxiety and morbid fascination, I decided to sneak in. The party was in full swing. The music, a jazzy, almost frantic melody, spilled out onto the lawn. The guests, a mix of ages in what appeared to be forced good cheer, milled about, holding glasses of what looked like deep crimson wine. I slipped through the side gate, hugging the shadows of the overgrown rose bushes, my heart hammering against my ribs. The back door, as I had suspected based on Mrs. Henderson's observations, was unlocked. I eased it open, stepping into the Davidsons' kitchen. It was immaculate, strangely devoid of any signs of the chaotic party spilling out onto the lawn. The stainless steel appliances gleamed under the sterile fluorescent light. Then I saw it. The dining room beckoned, the doorway, a dark maw in the otherwise bright kitchen. I crept forward, my breath catching in my throat. The dining table was massive, crafted from a single, impossibly dark slab of wood. It was meticulously set. Pristine white linen, ornate silverware, and crystal glasses that shimmered in the dim light cast by a single, flickering chandelier. But what lay upon each plate, it wasn't dinner. It was rotting meat, putrid, grayish-pink flesh, crawling with flies, sat festering on each plate. The stench was overpowering, a nauseating wave that almost brought me to my knees. And then I saw the chairs, empty, every single one of them, not empty in the sense that they were waiting to be filled, empty in a way that whispered of abandonment, of absence that had settled in like dust. The fabric was worn and faded, in stark contrast to the pristine tablecloth. Some were pushed away from the table as if hastily vacated, while others remained primly, unervingly upright. A chill snaked down my spine, colder than any night air. Where were the guests? Why was this horrifying feast laid out? Panic clawed at my throat. I had to get out. Now, I spun around, ready to bolt back to the kitchen, when I heard a low chuckle behind me. Enjoying the ambience, I whirled around, my blood turning to ice. Mr. Davidson stood in the doorway, his smile wide, too wide, revealing teeth that seemed a shade too sharp. His eyes, once a warm hazel, were now black pits, reflecting the flickering light of the chandelier. What is this? I stammered, gesturing weakly at the gruesome display. His smile widened. Dinner, of course. We always have dinner on Friday. Tell me, neighbor, are you hungry? He took a step closer, and I finally understood. The smiles on the faces of the guests outside, the forced laughter, the unblinking eyes. They weren't alive. They were something else, something summoned, something trapped. And that rotting meat, it wasn't for them. It was them. I turned and ran, the image of that grotesque table, the empty chairs, and Mr. Davidson's hungry smile seared into my brain. I didn't stop running until I was safely locked in my own house, every window and door bolted shut. The music still drifted over from the Davidsons' house, but it sounded different now. It was a dirge, a mournful lament for the living, and a seductive invitation to the dead. I peeked through the blinds. The guests were still milling around, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were trapped there, forever at the Davidsons' Friday night dinner party, forever present but forever gone. The Davidsons still live next door. The aroma of rosemary and something acrid still hangs in the air every Friday. And I know, with a bone-chilling certainty, that the empty chairs at their table will never be filled by those who truly leave. They'll be filled by those who become the feast. And I pray, every single Friday night, that I'm not next. The glacier's secret. The roar had been subtle at first, a low rumble barely audible over the wind whipping down from the mountains. We're used to glacial calving in this valley. It's part of life in Helgestad, Norway. But this was different. This was violent. It shook the foundations of our homes and rattled the windows in their frames. Then came the discovery. A fissure, a gaping maw of blue ice, had cracked open high on the Jostedalsbreen Glacier, and within, nestled in the icy embrace, lay the unmistakable silhouette of a Viking longship, perfectly preserved. Almost. The news raced through town like wildfire. Tourists flocked, cameras flashing. Scientists arrived, their faces alight with scholarly intrigue. They carefully, painstakingly, began to excavate the vessel, marveling at the craftsmanship of the wood, the intricate carvings along the prow. Then they found the bodies, all 12 of them, Viking warriors, frozen in time, still clad in their furs and mail. But something was terribly, brutally wrong. Every single one was headless. No sign of the heads was found on the ship or anywhere within the immediate vicinity of the glacier. Theories exploded. Avalanches, wild animals, a rogue ice axe during the initial collapse that scattered the skulls? None felt quite right. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate. A grim, unarticulated unease settled over Helgestad. That was yesterday. Tonight, the power died, just flickered out, plunging the town into an oppressive darkness. The wind howled, a mournful cry that seemed to echo the glacier's groaning. I huddled by the dying embers in my fireplace, the only source of light in my small cabin. Then I heard it, a scraping, a rhythmic, almost ritualistic scraping against my door. Slow, deliberate. Each scrape sent shivers down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed the old axe my grandfather had left me, its head heavy and comforting in my trembling hand. I crept towards the door, my breath catching in my throat. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I peered through the peephole, but the darkness was absolute. I could see nothing. The scraping continued, relentless and unnerving. What was it? A bear? A wolf? But the rhythm, the precision, it felt wrong. Human, but not human as I understood it. I tightened my grip on the axe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the senseless. The glacier, the ship, the headless bodies, the unnatural chill that had gripped the town since the discovery. And now this. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Suddenly, a single guttural word ripped through the wind. A word I didn't understand, yet somehow I knew. It was Old Norse, ancient, primeval, Hofud, head. That was it. The truth slammed into me with the force of a calving glacier. They were looking for their heads, the headless Vikings, and they knew. They somehow knew who had them. Had the scientists disturbed something they shouldn't have? Had they unwittingly unleashed a long-dormant curse? Or was something far more sinister at play? The scraping intensified, morphing into a furious pounding. The door shuddered under the assault. My cabin was small and isolated, and my only defense was an old axe and a rapidly dwindling fire. I had two choices: hide and hope they eventually went away, or open the door and face whatever horror awaited me on the other side. The door splintered. With a scream that tore from my throat, I braced myself and swung the axe. The darkness swallowed the sound, but I felt the impact. Something heavy, unyielding, stopped my swing. Then, a voice, cold and ancient, echoed from the darkness. "Give us back what is ours." The weight pulled me forward. The door gave way, and in the inky blackness I saw them. Tall, gaunt figures, their bodies clad in ancient armor, their necks grotesquely empty, and in their hands they held axes. The wind howled, the glacier groaned, and the headless Vikings came for what was theirs. This was Helgstad's secret, finally revealed, and it seemed, was about to become part of it. The Night Watchers. The chill was permanent in Oakhaven. It burrowed under your skin in the day and gnawed at your bones at night. Some blamed the proximity to the Ravenwood Forest, others the old mining accident that poisoned the well water decades ago. But lately, the chill felt different, felt watched. It started subtly, a flicker in your peripheral vision, a sense of unease that lingered after sunset. Then the figures appeared, tall, silhouetted against the night sky, perched on the rooftops. They were always there, just a silent, unwavering presence gazing into the windows of Oakhaven. The Night Watchers. Old Martha Willoughby was the first to speak of them publicly. She'd seen one on the roof of the bakery, she'd claimed, during the late-night rush. People scoffed. Martha was known for her eccentricities, her stories of whispering trees and mischievous sprites. But then young Timmy Hargrave disappeared, gone without a trace. Sarah Hargrave, Timmy's mother, swore she'd seen a figure on the roof of their house the night Timmy vanished. She'd dismissed it as a trick of the light, a strange angle of the overgrown oak in their backyard. Now, she clung to the memory, her eyes hollow with grief and a growing, chilling fear. The fear became a wildfire. People whispered behind cupped hands, drawing curtains tight, avoiding walking alone at night. They spoke of the watchers, of their unblinking eyes and their unnerving silence. They said the watchers were drawn to attention, to acknowledgement, that pointing them out was a death sentence for someone you loved. I was a skeptic, a journalist from the city, sent to Oak Haven to write a puff piece about the autumnal beauty of the region. Now I was knee-deep in a horror story. I interviewed terrified residents, pored over police reports that yielded nothing but dead ends, and spent countless nights staring at the rooftops, armed with a camera and a growing sense of dread. Then I saw it. On the roof of the old town hall, a dark figure stood silhouetted against the moon. It was impossibly still, its head cocked slightly as if listening. My heart hammered against my ribs. Logic screamed at me to dismiss it, to blame it on fatigue, on the pervasive fear that gripped the town. But my instincts, honed after years of chasing stories, told me this was real. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a desperate need to understand, I raised my camera. My finger hesitated over the shutter button. The stories, the warnings echoed in my mind, but I couldn't resist. I had to know. I snapped the picture. The figure shifted. His head turned directly toward me. For a split second, I could almost make out features, a long, gaunt face, and hollow eyes that seemed to burn even in the darkness. Then it raised a hand. It waved. A wave so slow, so deliberate, that it felt like a curse. The next morning, my sister, Clara, called. We hadn't spoken in months, not since a stupid argument over a borrowed dress. But her voice was frantic, laced with a terror that mirrored the fear in Oak Haven. She was home alone, she said, and she kept hearing noises, scratches at the windows, whispers on the wind. She was terrified. I tried to calm her, to reassure her that it was just the wind, that she was safe. But the words felt hollow, meaningless. I knew what was happening. I saw something outside. Liam, she whispered, her voice trembling. On the roof across the street. It's just staring. The line went dead. I called back, again and again, but there was no answer. I drove back to Oak Haven that night, a broken man. The watchers were still there, perched on the rooftops, their unblinking eyes fixed on the windows below. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I knew it was futile. I had brought this upon myself, upon Clara. Now, I stand on the roof of my hotel, staring out at the darkened town. The chill gnaws deeper than ever. I understand now. The watchers don't just stare. They wait. They wait for someone to acknowledge them, to point them out. And when you do, they claim their price. A loved one. Perhaps, I think, staring at the figures on the rooftops, perhaps they are not malevolent. Perhaps they are simply guardians, warning us to look away, to remain ignorant. The price of knowledge, it seems, is a loss beyond measure. And tonight, I know they are waiting for me. Perhaps they are waiting for me to join them. Perhaps the only way to end the nightmare is to become one of the night watchers myself. The locked out man. The rhythmic thud started precisely at 11:17 p.m. Every night, every single night for the past 3 weeks. Thud, 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 followed by the same desperate, strangled cry. Let me in! It's coming! I tried ignoring it. I blasted music, I'd even once called the police. They'd found nothing, no sign of forced entry. No one lurking in the shadows, just the lingering scent of cheap whiskey clinging to the chilly night air. And then, at 11:17 the following night, the pounding would resume. He sounded distraught, like a man on the edge of sanity, clinging to the last vestiges of hope. His voice, though I'd never seen his face, was familiar, vaguely comforting, like a half-remembered childhood lullaby warped into a terrifying plea. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. Peering out the peephole was useless. He was just below, perpetually shrouded in the gloom of the stairwell. I imagined him hunched, hair disheveled, eyes wide with a terror I couldn't comprehend. Initially, I was terrified, then irritated, then just bone-weary. The lack of sleep was grating on me. The constant fear, the gnawing uncertainty, had turned my stomach into a permanent knot. Last night, the pounding was more frantic, the plea more desperate. "Let me in. Please, let me in. It's coming. It's right behind me." The words were thick with a raw, visceral fear that resonated deep within me. Something cracked. Maybe it was my sleep-deprived brain, maybe it was a sliver of empathy, or maybe it was just plain exhaustion. I hesitated. My hand trembled above the deadbolt. Every instinct screamed at me to keep the door locked, to remain safe within my little sanctuary. But the desperation in his voice was a siren song, luring me towards the rocks. Finally, with a shaky breath, I unlocked the door. I tugged it open a crack, just enough to see his face. He was normal, shockingly so. He wasn't the raving lunatic I'd pictured. His hair was neatly combed, his clothes clean, if a little rumpled. His eyes, though bloodshot, held a strange, almost unsettling clarity. "Thank you," he breathed, pushing the door inward. He stepped inside, and I instinctively recoiled. "Who are you?" I stammered, fear flooding my system. "What do you want?" He didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, a small, almost apologetic smile playing on his lips. He looked around my apartment, taking in the bookshelves, the worn couch, and the half-eaten bowl of cereal on the coffee table. Then he turned back to me. The light from the hallway cast long shadows across his face, making his smile look broader and more menacing. "Too late," he said, his voice a low, smooth purr. "Too late for what?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. His smile widened, revealing a glint of teeth. "It's already inside." He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The air in the room thickened, becoming heavy and oppressive. A prickling sensation crawled over my skin. I felt something shift, something unseen, something malevolent settling in beside me. He was gone, vanished as silently and suddenly as he'd appeared. The door was still open, ajar by a mere inch, but the stairwell was empty. I stood there, frozen, the silence of my apartment suddenly deafening. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was no longer alone. The it he'd spoken of was here, inside, with me, and I had no idea what it was, or what it wanted. But I knew, with dawning horror, that I had just invited it in. The last town. The map was a tattered, greasy thing, held together by hope and duct tape. I ran my finger across its faded surface, tracing the ghost outlines of cities that no longer existed. Chicago, Detroit, even Topeka erased. My finger stopped at a knot of overlapping, looping roads, the kind nightmares are made of. They all led back to each other, a Mobius strip of asphalt despair. I hadn't seen another soul in weeks. Weeks of gnawing hunger, of sleeping with one eye open, of listening to the static hiss of my radio for any sign of life that wasn't the rustling of mutated rats the size of small dogs. The map was my only companion, a grim reminder of what was lost and a frustrating guide to nowhere. Then I saw him. He was perched on the crumbling overpass, a lanky figure silhouetted against the blood-orange sunset. His clothes were ripped and stained, but he held himself with an almost unnerving casualness. I stopped the jeep, the engine sputtering like a dying cough. "You lost?" he asked, his voice surprisingly melodic. He hopped down with an agility that belied his appearance, landing lightly on the ravaged asphalt. "Aren't we all?" I replied, stepping out of the jeep. I kept my hand close to the rusty pipe I carried for protection. "Looking for a town. Any town. Map says there should be something around here, but..." I gestured to the endless stretch of cracked highway, weeds pushing through the fissures, a landscape of desolate silence. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Map? Are you trusting a map? Honey, those maps are about as useful as a screen door on a submarine." He ambled closer, his eyes, a startling shade of violet, fixed on me. I felt a prickle of unease under my skin. He was different, not like the desperate scavengers I'd encountered before, driven mad by hunger and fear. He had a detachment. "There are no cities left," he said, his voice almost a whisper. The cities were cleared, efficiently. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tarnished silver harmonica. He raised it to his lips and played a mournful tune, a melody that spoke of loss and forgotten dreams. "You're the last one," he said when he finished, the harmonica gleaming in his hand. "The last one they haven't found. They're coming to clean up." My blood iced over. Who's coming?" He shrugged, a gesture that sent another wave of unease through me. The ones who decided enough was enough. The ones who decided to start fresh. Think of them as landscape gardeners, clearing out the weeds. He laughed again, a high-pitched, unsettling sound that bounced off the skeletal remains of buildings in the distance. "Don't worry, though. It's quick, relatively painless. And hey," he winked, a flash of something sharp and unsettling in his violet eyes. "At least you won't have to worry about that map anymore." He turned and started to walk away, his lanky frame disappearing into the twilight. I stood there, frozen, the harmonica's lingering echo hanging in the air. "Wait!" I shouted, but he didn't stop. "Wait! What do I do?" He paused for a moment, then called back over his shoulder, his voice distorted by the distance. "Enjoy the sunset." Then he was gone. I looked at the map clutched in my hand, felt heavier now, a useless burden. I ripped it in half, then in half again, and again until the fragments scattered in the wind, blending with the dust and despair. The sunset was beautiful, a fiery explosion of color against the dying light. I leaned against the jeep, the cold metal biting into my skin. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind whisper through the skeletal remains of the world. He was right. It was beautiful and terrifying. I waited for the end, for the landscape gardeners, for them to come and clean up. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into darkness. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp. They were coming. The vortex, the park, usually a haven of rustling leaves and boisterous laughter, was now choked with the sterile hum of generators and the sharp scent of antiseptic. A perfect, yawning maw had opened in the middle of the rose garden. A sinkhole that swallowed sunlight and spat back only an echo of unnerving silence. The scientists, a grim gaggle of hard hats and clipboards, claimed it was a geological anomaly, a bottomless chasm gouged out by forces beyond comprehension. They ran tests, dropped weighted lines that never touched the bottom, and scratched their chins with increasing bewilderment. But the truth, the cold, creeping dread, wasn't in their data. It was in the silence. Everyone in Oak Haven knew someone who had gone missing. Little Timmy from down the street vanished while chasing pigeons. Old Mrs. Gable had gone on her usual morning walk. Sarah Miller, my best friend, disappeared just 2 weeks ago after her evening jog through the park. The police called them runaways, vagrants, and victims of foul play. I knew better. They had been taken. I lived across the street from the park, my bedroom window offering a morbid, unobstructed view of the sinkhole's gaping maw. Every night, the park was bathed in the harsh glare of floodlights, a constant reminder of the void that had opened up in our lives. I started having trouble sleeping. The silence especially became unbearable. That's when I started hearing them. Last night, I couldn't even pretend to sleep. The air hung thick and heavy, pregnant with unspoken fear. Suddenly, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur drifted through my open window. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. They were faint, distorted, like a half-remembered dream, rising from the depths of the sinkhole. A chorus of whispers, a cacophony of disembodied voices, each calling out in a desperate, haunting plea. "Mommy?" A child's voice whimpered, chilling me to the bone. "Sarah? Where are you, Sarah?" Another voice cried out, laced with a raw, familiar panic. It was Sarah's mother. I knew it. "Help me." That one was different, deeper, more desperate than the rest. It resonated with a primal fear that clawed at my own sanity. I stumbled to the window, pressing my face against the glass. The voices grew louder, more distinct, swirling around me like a ghostly current. They were calling out our names, their loved ones, the mundane details of their lives before they were swallowed by the darkness. I recognized Timmy's high-pitched giggle and Mrs. Gable's gentle humming tune. They were trapped, lost in the abyss, begging for someone to hear them. And then I heard Sarah's voice. "Liam?" she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. "Liam, is that you?" Tears streamed down my face. "Sarah, I'm here. Can you hear me? Liam, get out. Get out of Oak Haven. It's not safe. It's hungry." Her voice faded, replaced by a chorus of echoing pleas, their despair washing over me like a tidal wave. Her warning echoed in my head. It's hungry. A cold understanding dawned on me. The sinkhole wasn't just a geological anomaly. It was a living thing, a predator that had been slumbering beneath Oak Haven, waking now to feed. I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't ignore Sarah's warning, but I couldn't just leave them either. The weight of their pleas, their fragmented cries, clung to me like shackles. My gaze fell on the rope ladder I'd built in my teens to sneak out at night. It was tucked away in the back of my closet, dusty and forgotten. An idea, terrifying and desperate, began to form. I wouldn't run. I would go down. I would try to find them, to bring them back, or at least to understand what had happened to them. I grabbed the ladder, the rough hemp digging into my palms. The voices were louder now, surging with renewed hope. "Help us! Don't forget us!" I climbed out the window, the night air biting at my skin. The sinkhole gaped before me, a black abyss swallowing the artificial light. Taking a deep breath, I secured the ladder to the sturdy oak tree beside my house. The descent was slow, agonizingly slow. The air grew colder, thicker, laced with the stench of damp earth and something else, something acrid and alien. As I descended further, the voices intensified, surrounding me, guiding me deeper into the unknown. I knew I was walking into madness, into the heart of a nightmare. But Sarah was calling, and I couldn't ignore her. Down I went, into the vortex, into the darkness, praying that somewhere, amidst the chaos and despair, there was still a sliver of hope. The fractal plague. The itch started subtly, a phantom tickle on my left wrist. I dismissed it, blamed it on the new wool sweater. But then came the redness, a faint flush that spread like spilled wine. I figured it was eczema, another joy of sensitive skin. I slathered on lotion, ignored it. That was 2 weeks ago. Now, my wrist is a canvas of creeping geometry. The redness has bloomed into an intricate pattern, an endless repeating series of triangles, spirals, and squares, all rendered in a pulsating crimson. It's beautiful, terrifyingly so. It's like looking into a digital kaleidoscope that somehow imprinted itself on my flesh. The doctors are baffled. Dr. Sharma, my general practitioner, looked at it with a furrowed brow, muttering about dermatological anomalies. Dr. Lee, the dermatologist she referred me to, ran a battery of tests, drew vials of blood, and scanned my skin with probes that buzzed and hummed. The results came back inconclusive. We've never seen anything like this, Mr. Abernathy, Dr. Lee said, his voice hushed and laced with a fear I mirrored. The pattern, it's eating your DNA. It's rewriting your genetic code. Eating my DNA. The words echoed in my head like a broken record. He explained, in clinical terms that sounded like science fiction, how the pattern was disrupting the double helix, replicating itself within my cells, twisting them into its maddening design. The days that followed were a blur of tests, consultations, and increasingly frantic research on my part. I scoured the internet, wading through conspiracy theories and crackpot remedies. Nothing. No mention of a fractal plague. No record of any similar affliction. I was alone, a walking, talking medical anomaly. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford. The itching intensified, spreading up my arm, across my chest, down my legs. The geometric patterns followed, each shape a miniature inferno on my skin. I scratched until I bled, leaving angry red welts that quickly transformed into the same repeating designs. And then came the hallucinations. It started with peripheral flickers, shadows dancing in the corners of my eyes. I dismissed them as exhaustion, but they grew more vivid, more insistent. I'd see the patterns floating in the air, swirling around me like shimmering dust motes. Last night was the worst. I woke in the middle of the night, parched and disoriented. I stumbled to the bathroom, flicked on the light, and froze. My reflection wasn't singular. It was a cascade, an echoing infinity. A dozen, then 100, then 1,000 versions of myself stared back from the mirror, each slightly different, each distorted by the creeping fractal pattern that now covered most of my face. They moved independently, mimicked me with a chilling delay, whispered in layered, discordant voices that filled the small room with a cacophony of my own anxieties and fears. I screamed, a raw, animal sound that shattered the fragile silence of the night. I slammed my fist against the mirror, shattering the glass into a million fragments, each reflecting a sliver of my fractured reality. The visions vanished. Now, in the cold morning light, I'm left with the shards of glass on the floor and the terrifying certainty that I'm losing myself, piece by piece, to this insidious plague. My skin is a roadmap of its progress, my mind a battlefield of its conquest. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know what this pattern is or where it came from. I only know that it's consuming me, rewriting me into something else. I'm writing this as a desperate plea, a last attempt to leave some record of who I was before I completely disappeared, because I fear that soon there will be nothing left of David Abernathy but an infinite, repeating echo, a fractal ghost trapped within a geometric nightmare. And I wonder, as the pattern inches closer to my eyes, what that echo will become. Will it remember me, or will it simply be a fragment of the plague, forever replicating, forever spreading, an endless, repeating horror unleashed upon an unsuspecting world? The cult of the eclipse. The flyer was tattered, almost falling apart, but the message was clear. Attend the rebirth. Witness celestial reunion. Below, a crude drawing of a sun being swallowed by a moon. Curiosity, that familiar mistress, dragged me to the woods outside town. They called themselves the Lunarians. 100 or so individuals, cloaked in white, gathered in a clearing. An altar of rough-hewn stone sat in the center, adorned with symbols I vaguely recognized as astronomical. Their leader, a gaunt woman with eyes that burned with unsettling fervor, stood upon the altar. "The eclipse approaches," she cried, her voice echoing through the trees. "The great weaver prepares to reknit the threads of existence. We must be ready to guide the sun back from the void." I was a science student, a skeptic by nature. Eclipses were predictable celestial events, not cosmic rebirths requiring the assistance of chanting cultists. Yet, there was a strange magnetism to their devotion, a palpable energy in the air that prickled my skin. That night, under the watchful eye of a waning moon, the ritual began. The Lunarians swayed, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. The leader sprinkled what looked like dried herbs onto the altar, filling the air with a pungent, earthy aroma. I, drawn in by the hypnotic rhythm, found myself swaying with them. They passed around cups filled with a dark, bitter liquid. Reluctantly, I took a sip, tasted like earth and regret. As the night deepened, the chanting intensified. The leader pointed to the sky, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "Feel the pull. Embrace the darkness. Become the vessel." Something shifted within me. A strange warmth spread through my veins, loosening the rigid grip of my skepticism. The symbols on the altar began to glow, pulsating with an otherworldly light. The chanting grew louder, filling my head and drowning out my thoughts. The day of the eclipse arrived. A heavy, oppressive darkness settled over the clearing even before the moon began its dance. The Lunarians were in a frenzy, their movements jerky, their voices raw with anticipation. The leader looked directly at me, a chilling smile on her face. "You are ready," she whispered. "You are the key." Then totality. The world plunged into an eerie twilight. A collective gasp swept through the Lunarians. Their chanting reached a crescendo, a cacophony of sound that vibrated in my bones. And then I felt it, a surge of power, raw and untamed, flowing through me. I felt my own voice joining the chant, but it wasn't my voice. It was deeper, more resonant, imbued with an ancient, unsettling authority. The eclipse passed, The sun began to peek through the receding shadow, but something was wrong. The light was weak, hesitant. The sun struggled, faltering like a dying ember. Days turned into weeks. The sun never fully rose. The sky remained in a perpetual state of twilight. Crops withered, animals grew listless, and a chilling despair settled over the land. Panic erupted. Accusations flew. The Lunarians, initially triumphant, grew fearful. They looked at me, their faces etched with desperation. You were the chosen one. You must fix it. But I couldn't explain. I barely remembered the ritual, only fragments of the chanting, the bitter taste of the liquid, the overwhelming power, and the voice that still echoed in my head during the day and in my dreams. I tried to find answers, searching for clues in ancient texts, consulting with scientists and astrologers, but nothing made sense. The laws of physics seemed to have bent, broken, twisted beyond recognition. I returned to the clearing, the scene of our cosmic folly. The altar stood silent, the symbols now dull and lifeless. I sat on the cold stone, the oppressive twilight weighing down on me. Then I heard it, the chant, faint at first, barely audible, but it grew stronger, resonating from within me. My mouth moved, forming the ancient syllables. My voice filled the clearing, echoing the Lunarians' desperate plea. I am trapped. My mind, my body, is a vessel for something ancient, something powerful, something that has disrupted the balance of the universe. The sun won't rise, and their chants are in my voice. I joined their ritual, seeking answers. Now I am the question, and I fear the answer is oblivion. The starless sky, the silence was the worst. It used to be pierced by the gentle hum of the night, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. But since the stars vanished, a week ago, the night had swallowed all sound. It was as if even the insects knew something was wrong, something deeply unnatural. My name is Elias Thorne, and I'm an astronomer. Or I was. Now, I'm just a man staring into an empty void, clinging to a profession that feels obsolete. The stars, my lifelong companions, were gone, replaced by a uniform, oppressive blackness that sucked the light from the world. They didn't fade. They simply blinked out, leaving behind nothing but an unsettling emptiness. The official story? Atmospheric anomalies, light pollution reaching unprecedented levels, and even mass delusion. But I knew better. I knew what I saw. Every night, I dragged my old, battered telescope out onto the observation deck of my small, secluded cabin. The deck was usually bathed in the soft glow of starlight, perfect for astrophotography. Now it felt like stepping into a tomb. The first night, I dismissed the void as some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. But then I pointed my telescope upwards, and that's when I saw it. A pulsating ripple in the blackness, like a heartbeat in the abyss. At first, I thought it was a glitch in the telescope, a trick of the light. But the ripple was real, a disturbance in the fabric of whatever had replaced the stars. And within that disturbance, I saw something massive. It was impossible to describe, unlike anything I had ever seen in any textbook or astronomical chart. It wasn't a planet or a nebula or a comet. It was organic, a colossal, shifting, amorphous structure that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It was dark, darker than the void around it. Its surface a chaotic jumble of impossible angles and unidentifiable shapes. And it was moving, slowly, agonizingly slow, but definitely moving, towards Earth. Each night since, I've returned to my telescope, a morbid curiosity driving me onwards. The entity grows larger, its details sharpening with each passing hour. I can now discern what looks like tendrils, vast, inky appendages reaching out like grasping claws. Sleep is a luxury I can no longer afford. Every waking moment is consumed by calculations, by frantic attempts to understand what I'm seeing. I've contacted every observatory, every astronomer I know, sent countless emails, backed up with photographic evidence, hoping to elicit a response. The replies are always the same: equipment malfunction, atmospheric interference. We recommend you seek psychological evaluation. They don't believe me. They can't see it. Or maybe they can, and they're too afraid to admit it. Tonight, the air is thick with an unnatural stillness. The silence is deafening. As I trudge onto the observation deck, I can feel a cold tremor in the ground. The entity has grown exponentially. It now fills a significant portion of the sky, its impossible geometry pressing down on me, suffocating me. I point my telescope upwards, my hands shaking. The image is overwhelming. The tendrils are closer now, clearly defined, reaching toward our planet like the roots of some cosmic parasite. I can almost feel their pull, a strange, unnerving sensation that crawls under my skin. Tonight, I see something new. At the heart of the entity is a single point of light. Not a star, but something far more sinister. An eye, a vast, unblinking eye staring directly at me. I gasp, stumbling backward and knocking over my stool. I scramble to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The eye, it's getting closer. It's like the entity is accelerating, drawn by some unseen force, driven by a hunger I can't comprehend. I know what's coming. This isn't just some astronomical event. This is an invasion, an annihilation, and I'm the only one who sees it. I look back at the telescope, the eye now filling the entire field of view. Its gaze pierces me, stripping away my sanity and leaving me bare and exposed to its alien intelligence. Then the pressure hits, a wave of unimaginable force that crushes my chest, steals the air from my lungs. I collapse onto the deck, gasping, choking, my bones screaming in protest. As my vision fades, I see it. The tendrils descend, enveloping the earth in their inky embrace. The silence intensifies, reaching a crescendo of absolute nothingness. The last thing I see, before the darkness claims me completely, is the eye. It blinks, and in that single terrifying moment, I understand. The stars didn't vanish. They were eaten, and now we are next. The astronaut's message. The crackle on the radio was so loud that Dr. Eris Thorne almost missed the words. Repeat station, final transmission, Project Icarus, critical failure. Don't look up. Then static, oblivion. Eris was head of Project Nightingale, the team monitoring the ISS for any signs of distress. He'd heard the desperation in Commander Eva Rostova's voice, a tremor rarely present even during simulated emergencies. Rostova, a titan of space, was scared. Don't look up. What did that even mean? He relayed the message to his team. Silence hung thick in the sterile control room, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the servers. Maya, the astrophysicist, was the first to find words. Maybe a solar flare? Some kind of electromagnetic pulse. Eris dismissed the idea. Rostova would have been more specific. She'd have used scientific language, not a cryptic warning. Then it started. Reports trickled in, at first isolated incidents dismissed as mass hysteria. People collapsing in the streets, their eyes bulging, their skin blistering as if flash fried from the inside. The common thread, they had been looking at the sky. Eris, a man of science, scoffed. Correlation didn't equal causation, but the reports multiplied, each one more horrifying than the last. Videos surfaced online, raw and terrifying. Crowds pointing at the sky, their faces filled with awe, then the screams, the melting. The internet, usually a breeding ground for conspiracy theories, was unified in a single horrified truth. Don't look up. The world descended into chaos. Governments crumbled and economies collapsed. The streets were littered with the dead, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and disbelief. Eris barricaded himself in the Nightingale facility, holed up with Maya and a handful of other scientists who stubbornly clung to the hope that they could understand what was happening. Days blurred into weeks. They ate canned goods, slept in shifts, and pored over data, searching for a pattern, an explanation. Maya discovered that the incidents coincided with a specific spectral frequency emanating from somewhere. It wasn't the sun, not in any way they understood. This was something else. Its radiation, Eris, but unlike anything we've ever seen, Maya said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. It's targeted. It's triggered by consciousness. By looking at it, Eris felt a cold dread creep into his bones. Targeted. Rostova knew. They all knew. He went back to Rostova's final transmission, running it through every filter and enhancement software they had. Faint, barely audible, but there. A background noise, like a whisper underneath the static. He isolated it, amplified it. It wasn't Russian, Rostova's native tongue, nor English. It sounded alien. This is a signal, he stammered, showing Maya the waveform, a transmission embedded within the static. They knew this was coming. He realized with crushing certainty that Project Icarus hadn't been about exploring space. It had been about finding something out there, and they had found it. And whatever it was now looking back. They spent their remaining days trying to decipher the alien signal, driven by a desperate need to understand. They managed to isolate a few repeating patterns, what appeared to be mathematical sequences, but they were nowhere close to breaking the code. One evening, Eris found Maya staring out of the window, a vacant look in her eyes. "Maya, what are you doing?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "Maya, no, don't." He tried to pull her away, but she was too strong. He could feel the heat radiating off her skin and smell the faint scent of burning flesh. Her pupils dilated, filling her eyes with a terrifying, otherworldly light. Then she screamed, a long, agonizing scream that ended in a wet, gurgling sound. Eris staggered back, sickened. Maya was gone, reduced to a grotesque parody of her former self. He was alone. He knew the end was coming. He knew he couldn't hide forever. Curiosity, that insatiable human drive, would eventually win. He found himself staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster with his eyes. He knew he shouldn't. He knew what happened when you looked up, but he couldn't help it. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and slowly, deliberately lifted his gaze. He saw nothing. Then, a blinding light. Not the light of the sun, but something colder, sharper, more alien. Images flashed through his mind, incomprehensible geometries, impossible colors, and concepts that shattered the very foundations of his understanding. He felt his mind unravel, his body disintegrate. His last thought, before oblivion consumed him, was a single terrifying realization. They weren't melting. They were being rewritten. The time fracture. The grandfather clock in the hall wheezed. A noise I hadn't heard it make since, well, ever. More concerning, the pendulum swung in reverse. A shiver snaked down my spine. I chalked it up to a faulty spring. I'd deal with it later. Downstairs, the digital clock on the microwave displayed 7:12 a.m., then flickered and jumped back to 7:11 a.m. Okay, that was weird. Glancing at my phone, the time was correct. 7:12 a.m. Maybe I was just tired. I needed coffee. Across the street, Mr. Henderson, my neighbor, was getting his mail. He looked different. I squinted. He was always a spry 60, but now he looked gaunt. His skin paper thin, his stoop much more pronounced. His silver hair had thinned to a wispy white. He looked 80, maybe even older. "Morning, Mr. Henderson," I called out, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. He turned, his eyes clouded with confusion. "Morning, son," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. He used a trembling hand to steady himself on the mailbox. "Son?" Mr. Henderson knew my name. He'd known it for years. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The coffee did little to calm me. The news was filled with nonsensical stories. Train derailments caused by temporal distortions, reports of people aging rapidly in certain areas, and even videos of clocks running backward, dismissed as hoaxes or mass hysteria by the anchors. The stories only fueled my growing panic. I ventured out, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. The streets felt off. The air hung heavy, almost stagnant. The leaves on the trees seemed to be rapidly decaying, turning brown and crumbling. Then it happened. A little girl, no older than 5, pointed at me from across the street, her eyes wide with terror. "It's already eaten you," she shrieked, clutching her mother's leg. "It's eaten you." Her mother, a young woman with tired eyes, pulled her away, muttering apologies. "Just her imagination," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I stared after them, my blood turning to ice. Eaten by what? What had the little girl seen? I looked down at my hands. They seemed older. The skin is slightly looser, the veins more prominent. Driven by a desperate need to understand, I rushed to the library, the only place that still felt remotely stable. The librarian, Mrs. Peterson, a woman who prided herself on her encyclopedic knowledge, was frantically flipping through ancient tomes. "Something's happening, David," she said, her voice trembling. "A fracture, a tear in time itself." She showed me passages from forgotten texts, prophecies of chronal anomalies, of time, bleeding into itself, of entities that consumed years, stealing life and leaving behind empty husks. "The girl," she said, looking me directly in the eye. "She saw something in you, David, something unraveling." That night, I barricaded myself in my apartment, the grandfather clock in the hall chiming backward hours. Couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, felt like a threat. I glanced at my reflection in the darkened window. The face staring back was not the one I knew. The lines were deeper, the eyes haunted. The time fracture, it was real. It was consuming everything around me, and it was coming for me. The little girl had seen it. It was already eating me, stealing my life, my memories, my future. What could I do? How could I stop it? That's when I noticed the old photograph on my desk. A picture of my grandfather, standing proudly beside a clock tower he had helped build. He'd been a clockmaker, a master of time. An idea sparked in my mind, a desperate gamble. Maybe, just maybe, if I could understand the science of time, the mechanisms, the gears, I could find a way to repair the fracture. But time, it seemed, was running out. Literally. The grandfather clock chimed again, a dissonant, backward melody that echoed the terror in my soul. And in its reflection, I saw my face aging with each passing second. The race against time had begun, and I was already losing. The silent call, the incessant ringing was a digital torture. My phone lay vibrating on the coffee table, a malevolent little black rectangle radiating a discordant symphony of pings. I'd muted it, silenced it, even thought about throwing it against the wall, but the call persisted. One ring, a pause, then another relentless burst. The caller ID mocked me, my own number. It had started subtly. A missed call here, a random ring there. I dismissed them as glitches, software hiccups. But it had escalated over the past few hours, morphing into this agonizing, persistent campaign. Fear, cold and clammy, was starting to creep into my bones. Hesitantly, I reached for the phone. My hand hovered over the answer button. What was I even expecting? A prank? A marketing scheme gone horribly wrong? Or something else? Taking a deep breath, I swiped. The familiar green icon filled the screen. Silence. Just when I was about to hang up, a low, guttural static crackled in my ear. It morphed into something else, something deeper. Heavy, ragged breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhales that scratched against the silence like nails on a chalkboard. My blood turned to ice. "Hello," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. Only the rasping breath answered. It was unsettlingly close, as if the owner of that lung capacity was standing directly behind me, breathing down my neck. I hung up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The ringing started again almost immediately. My own number. Panicked, I checked my call log. A litany of calls, all incoming, all from myself. Each one marked with the same timestamp, the same duration. Mere seconds of static and breath. This wasn't a prank. This was something else entirely. I tried to rationalize. Maybe my phone was compromised, hacked by some malicious entity that wanted to torment me. I Googled frantically, "phone hacked, calling own number." The results were a terrifying rabbit hole of malware, identity theft, and worse. I tried changing my password, running a virus scan, and even resetting my phone to factory settings. Nothing worked. The calls continued an unending loop of digital dread. As darkness fell, the breathing seemed to intensify, becoming more urgent, more demanding. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows, whispers carried on the wind. Was I losing my mind? Driven to the edge, I answered the phone again. This time I was determined to say something, anything, to the thing on the other end. "What do you want?" I screamed into the phone, my voice cracking with fear. "Why are you doing this?" The breathing paused. For a fraction of a second, silence descended, thick and suffocating. Then, a new sound, a faint, distorted whisper, barely audible above the static. It sounded familiar. I strained to hear. The whisper grew louder, coalescing into words. "Help me." The voice, though distorted and raspy, was unmistakably mine, but older, wearier, and filled with an unbearable sorrow. My blood ran cold. This wasn't hacking. This wasn't malware. This was something far more profound, far more terrifying. The ringing paused. Then one final call came through. My own number. I answered it, my hand trembling so violently I could barely hold the phone. This time there was no static, no breathing, just my own voice, clear and resonant, speaking from the phone. "Don't forget," it said, the words echoing in the silent room. "You have to remember, otherwise you'll be trapped here with me." The line went dead. The phone powered off. Silence descended. A silence more terrifying than any static, any breathing, any chilling whisper. I stared at the black screen, the reflection of my own horrified face staring back. Trapped. Remind me, what had I forgotten? And what price would I pay for not remembering? The answer, I knew, lay in the silence, waiting to be unearthed. The answer, I feared, was myself, the uninvited guest. The silverware clattered against the china, a mundane symphony that grated on my nerves. Across the table, my daughter, Lily, rambled about her day at school, her words slurred and indistinct, like a radio struggling to find a clear frequency. My husband, Tom, nodded absently, his eyes fixed on the television flickering in the background. And then there was her. She sat at the head of the table directly opposite me, a woman I didn't know, with eyes like chipped slate and a smile that never quite reached them. She wore a dress of faded floral, the kind my grandmother used to wear. But my grandmother was gone. Every night she was there. The first time, I choked on my water, demanding, "Who is that? Why is she at our table?" Tom had looked at me, confused. Lily had giggled, calling me silly. "Mom, that's Aunt Clara. She's always here." Aunt Clara, a name that tasted foreign and unfamiliar on my tongue. I racked my brain, searching for a memory, a connection. Nothing. My insistence that we were missing someone, that there was an imposter amongst us, was met with increasing frustration and concern. My husband suggested stress. My daughter hinted at needing a vacation. Even my own reflection in the mirror seemed to question my sanity. But I knew I wasn't crazy. I could feel the wrongness of her presence, a discordant note in the familiar melody of my life. Tonight, as Lily recounted a playground squabble, Clara leaned forward, her voice a low rasp that somehow cut through the clatter. "Delicious lasagna, wasn't it, darling?" she said to Lily. Lily simply nodded, shoveling another bite into her mouth. I stared at Clara, a cold dread creeping through me. Lily had always hated lasagna. I'd stopped making it years ago. Later, after the dishes were cleared and Tom was engrossed in the news, I found myself alone with Clara in the kitchen. The silence hung heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. "Who are you?" I finally whispered, my voice trembling. Clara turned, her slate eyes meeting mine. There was a flicker of something in them, a hint of pity, perhaps. "They'll forget you too," she said, her voice barely audible. Her words hit me like a physical blow. A wave of nausea washed over me. Forget? What did she mean? Each night, the feeling of being erased grew stronger. My favorite mug was replaced with one I didn't recognize. My side of the bed felt colder, less familiar. Tom started calling me by my middle name, a name he hadn't used since we were teenagers. Lily stopped confiding in me. They were forgetting. One evening, I tried to show Tom our wedding album. He stared at the pictures, his brow furrowed. "We weren't that happy back then, were we?" he said, turning the page to a picture of Clara standing beside us, beaming. He pointed. "Remember Clara? She caught the bouquet." I looked at the picture, at the fake smile plastered on Clara's face, and a wave of despair threatened to drown me. My own face in the photograph looked distant, almost ghostly. The next morning, I woke up to a house devoid of my presence. My clothes were gone from the closet, replaced with Clara's faded floral prints. My toothbrush was missing from the bathroom. There were no pictures of me on the walls. I rushed downstairs, panic seizing my chest. Tom was in the kitchen making breakfast. "Morning, Han," he said, smiling warmly. "Sleep well." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Tom, don't you remember me? I'm your wife." He looked at me, his smile faltering. "Don't be silly, Clara. You're my aunt, and you're looking a little pale. Why don't you sit down? Breakfast will be ready in a minute." "Clara." He called me Clara. I stumbled back, the reality crashing down on me. I was being erased, replaced by her. I was becoming the uninvited guest, the forgotten presence. As I stood there, lost and terrified, Clara walked into the kitchen, her slate eyes devoid of any emotion. She placed a hand on Tom's shoulder and smiled. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked, her voice smooth and comforting. Tom pulled her close, his expression softening. "Everything's perfect, Clara. Absolutely perfect." Then she looked at me, a ghost in my own home. Her lips barely moved, but I heard her, clear as a bell. "They'll forget you too." And I knew with a horrifying certainty that she was right. The last flight, the jolt of the landing woke me with a start. Disoriented, I blinked, trying to focus on the blurred landscape outside the scratched window. Flat, gray plains stretched as far as the eye could see. The sky a monotone, oppressive lid. This wasn't Denver. This wasn't even close. I unbuckled and lumbered down the aisle, the plane silent except for the hum of the dying engines. The other passengers remained slumped in their seats, faces slack, eyes closed. Were they still sleeping? I nudged the woman in front of me. No response. I tried again, harder. Still nothing. Her skin was cold, unnaturally smooth. A shiver ran down my spine. The door hissed open as I reached the cockpit. The pilots sat rigidly in their seats, their hands frozen on the controls. Their faces were set in fixed, vacant smiles. It was then I noticed the unnerving stillness, the unnatural gloss of their skin. They weren't sleeping. They weren't alive. They were mannequins. Panic clawed at my throat. I stumbled out of the plane and onto the tarmac, the air thick and heavy with an unnatural silence. The airport shimmered in the strange, diffused light. It looked like an airport, smelled like an airport, but felt wrong. The terminal was a vast expanse of sterile white. Empty check-in desks stretched into the distance, manned by more of those frozen plastic figures. A newsstand was stocked with magazines from decades past, their covers faded and brittle. A coffee shop promised stale pastries with a knowing plastic smile. I was utterly alone. Then a crackle, a discordant buzz from a speaker overhead. My heart leaped into my throat. "Welcome," a voice echoed through the empty terminal. It was smooth, almost soothing, but laced with an unsettling metallic quality. "Welcome to the afterlife." I froze. The afterlife? Was this some kind of elaborate, macabre joke? Some twisted reality show? My mind scrambled for explanations, anything to deny the impossible. The voice continued, oblivious to my internal turmoil. "Please proceed to customs. Your paperwork is already waiting. Enjoy your stay." The announcement repeated, echoing through the vast emptiness of the terminal. Its gentle, unsettling tone amplifying the horror of my predicament. Customs was just more of the same. Row upon row of expressionless mannequins, dutifully stamping phantom passports with rubber stamps that clicked mechanically against empty counters. On each counter sat a single, pristine form. I picked one up, my hands trembling. It was a simple questionnaire. Name, date of birth, cause of death, cause of death. The blood drained from my face. I didn't remember dying. I remembered boarding the plane in Denver, weary but alive. What had happened? I looked back at the plane, a silver scar across the desolate landscape. Then I looked back at the form. My hand hovered over the blank space for the cause of death. The silence pulsed in my ears. Then I saw it. On the back of the form, in faint, almost invisible ink, was a single chilling sentence. There are no mistakes in the afterlife. Your presence here is its own answer. The terminal door swung open. Another plane had landed. More mannequins stood rigidly on its ramp, their plastic eyes fixed on the desolate horizon. I knew then. I didn't need to fill out the form. I understood why I was here. It was the last flight, the last soul, and I was finally home. The empty school, the fluorescent lights hummed a sickly tune, a stark contrast to the silence that was swallowing the old school whole. I packed my laptop, the click of the power button echoing unnaturally loud in the now empty classroom. Another night, another lecture on the socio-economic impact of postmodern literature was delivered to a handful of wide-eyed, sleep-deprived students. I genuinely enjoyed teaching, but the building itself always felt a little off. My students, bless their hearts, contributed to the unease. They'd whisper about the janitor, Old Man Hemlock, a wizened figure who always seemed to appear out of the shadows. He'd apparently warned them, with a gravelly voice and a finger wag, to be gone before dark. This school ain't right after the sun goes down, he'd croak, before disappearing back into the labyrinthine hallways. Tonight, however, Hemlock's warning had piqued my academic curiosity more than it instilled fear. I had a mountain of grading to do, and the idea of a quiet, solitary evening was too tempting to resist. Besides, I reasoned what could possibly happen in an empty school. I grabbed my bag, locked the classroom door, and stepped into the hallway. Immediately, the air felt colder and heavier. The usual background hum of the building, the faint thrum of electricity, seemed to have vanished, replaced by an oppressive stillness. I dismissed it as my imagination, the lingering chill of the autumn evening seeping through the ancient brick walls. As I walked, the silence began to fray. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was something else, something auditory. Faint, almost imperceptible whispers just beyond the threshold of hearing. I stopped, straining my ears. Leave, get out, not safe. The words were indistinct, a chorus of voices murmuring from behind closed doors, from within the walls themselves. I swallowed hard. This was ridiculous. I was a seasoned academic, a rational human being. Yet, the whispers clung to the air, a chilling symphony designed to prickle the hairs on the back of my neck. I told myself it was the wind, whistling through cracks in the aging windows. Then, I remembered the windows were all sealed shut for winter. My pace quickened as I reached the main staircase. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Gone too late, trapped. I descended the stairs, each footfall booming in the silence, amplifying the unsettling atmosphere. Reaching the ground floor, I found the foyer shrouded in near darkness. The single emergency light cast long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed like specters. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the foyer, near the perpetually locked front doors, a figure stood motionless. It was tall and gaunt, barely visible in the gloom. I squinted, trying to make out its features. "Hemlock!" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, an inky silhouette against the faint light filtering through the dusty windows. I took a tentative step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a tangible force. "He sees you, run. He's one of us." Panic began to claw at my throat. I wasn't alone, and this wasn't just an empty school. I turned and fled. I didn't think, I just ran. Back up the stairs, past the darkened classrooms, the whispers chasing me like phantom hounds. I reached my classroom, fumbled with the key, and practically threw myself inside, slamming the door shut. Leaning against the door, gasping for breath, I could still hear the whispers, now muffled, but still present. "You can't escape. This school never lets go." I huddled in the corner of the room, the flickering fluorescent lights my only companions. The rest of the night passed in a terrifying blur of silence and whispers. I didn't dare move, afraid of what I might see, what I might hear. As dawn broke, painting the sky with hues of gray and pink, the whispers began to fade. The air felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Finally, summoning all my courage, I unlocked the door and peered into the hallway. Empty, utterly, chillingly empty. I walked slowly towards the main staircase, my senses on high alert. The foyer was bathed in the pale light of morning. The figure was gone. I made my way to the front doors, the heavy oak panels scarred and worn. As I reached for the handle, I noticed something on the floor just beneath the threshold. A single, tarnished key. It was attached to a keyring with a small, engraved tag, "Hemlock Janitor." I never taught night classes again. I still teach, of course, but I made sure to transfer to the sunny, modern building on the other side of town. Now, whenever I pass an old, abandoned building, I can't help but hear those faint whispers, reminding me that some places are best left empty, lest they fill themselves with things we can't quite understand. The stalker's gift. The first gift was unsettling, but ignorable. A single crimson rose, throat snapped, lying on my porch swing. I tossed it in the trash, blaming a misguided admirer with poor taste. A week later, another one. This time, the crimson was deeper, almost black, the thorns sharper, practically daring me to touch it. Then came the locket, silver, tarnished, shaped like a heart. Inside, a miniature photograph of me, taken without my knowledge leaving the grocery store last month. Goosebumps erupted on my skin. I called the police. Officer Miller, young, eager to prove himself, dusted the locket and roses. Nothing. No fingerprints, no DNA, just the chilling implication that someone was watching me. He advised me to install security cameras, vary my routine, and lock all doors and windows. The usual platitudes. I did everything he suggested. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, peeking through blinds, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. The roses kept coming, each one more decayed, more menacing. With each delivery, the dread coiled tighter in my stomach. The worst part was the anonymity, the facelessness. It wasn't like an ex-boyfriend, a disgruntled coworker, or an angry neighbor. This was something else, something silent and omnipresent. Then came the coffin, It arrived on a Tuesday morning, shrouded in black tarp, blocking my driveway. The delivery driver, a nervous teenager with a tremor in his voice, just dropped it off, muttering something about wrong address and practically sprinting back to his truck. Underneath the tarp, polished cedarwood gleamed in the sunlight. It was a child's coffin at first glance, but as I got closer, I realized its sickening accuracy. It was my size. This time, I didn't touch it. I didn't even go near it. I called the police, hysteria bubbling in my throat. The street swarmed with officers. The crime scene taped a grotesque garland around my house. The coffin was meticulously examined. No fingerprints, no trace evidence. Just smooth, unblemished wood and the chilling knowledge that someone had measured me, had considered my dimensions with a terrifying intimacy. Officer Miller looked grim. "We're increasing patrols in the area, Ms. Davis. We need you to stay with family or friends. This is escalating." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I felt like I was drowning in fear. My best friend, Sarah, lived a few towns over. I packed a bag, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the zipper. As I drove away, I saw it. A single black rose lying on the hood of my car. This time it wasn't snapped. It was perfectly preserved as if frozen in time, the petals unfurling with a sinister beauty. I left it there. At Sarah's, I tried to relax, to breathe, to convince myself I was safe. But the image of the coffin, the feel of those invisible eyes on me, wouldn't leave my mind. I started seeing shadows in the corners of the room, hearing whispers in the silence. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat. Sarah was asleep in the next room. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I went to the window, peering out into the darkness, and then I saw him. He was standing in the shadows of Sarah's backyard, a tall, gaunt figure cloaked in darkness. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there watching. In his hand, he held a single black rose. I gasped, stumbling back from the window. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. I knew with chilling certainty that he wasn't going to hurt me. Not yet. He was savoring the fear, the despair. He was waiting for the perfect moment. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. The police arrived, swarming the house. They searched the grounds but found nothing. No footprints, no evidence. Just the chilling echo of my fear. Officer Miller looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and frustration. "Ms. Davis, we need you to tell us something. Anything. Is there anyone you can think of who would want to do this to you?" I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know. I swear, I don't know." He sighed. "Maybe it's time you considered professional help, Ms. Davis. Sometimes these things are internal." The implication hung in the air like a shroud. He thought I was hallucinating, losing my mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe the stalker was just a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of my deepest fears. But I knew better. I knew he was real. I could feel him, a dark presence lurking just beyond the edge of my perception. Later that night, while Sarah slept soundly, I went back to the window. The backyard was empty, but lying on the windowsill, pressed against the glass, was a single black rose. Clutched in its thorns was a small, folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. One word was written in elegant, spidery script. Patience. The Bone Garden. The summer I turned 12, I fell out of the old oak in Mrs. Gable's yard. It wasn't a dramatic, spiraling descent like in the movies. just a clumsy, off-balance slide that ended with a sickening crack in my left arm. The doctors said it was a clean break, but messy. Something about the way the bone shattered meant it needed extra pins and plates. I spent the rest of the summer in a cast, feeling like a prisoner in my own skin. When the cast finally came off, my arm was a pale, withered thing. The doctor reassured me it would regain its strength. He sent me to physical therapy, promising that in a few weeks I'd be as good as new. He was wrong. Instead of getting better, my arm started to ache. A deep, gnawing ache that no amount of pain medication could dull. Then came the itching, an infernal, maddening itch that felt like bugs were crawling beneath my skin. And then the thorns. They started as tiny, almost imperceptible bumps, nestled around the scar where the surgery had been. I dismissed them as ingrown hairs at first, but they grew quickly, hardening into brittle, black thorns that pricked against my clothes. Horror clawed at me the first time I realized what they were. They weren't skin, they were bone. Bone, twisted and sharpened, erupting from my flesh. My parents, of course, didn't believe me. They saw the bumps, the angry red skin, but dismissed it as a post-surgical skin reaction. They slathered creams on it, told me not to scratch, and sent me back to physical therapy, where Mrs. Peterson just looked at me with pity and told me to push through the discomfort. The thorns thrived on my disbelief. They multiplied, snaking around my arm like a thorny vine. They poked through my skin with agonizing precision. Then came the hunger. It started subtly, a craving for rare steak, blood pudding, things I'd never liked before. Then it morphed into something more primal, more desperate. I found myself staring at people, imagining the flow of blood beneath their skin. One night, I woke up to a sharp, stinging pain in my arm. I stumbled to the bathroom, flipped on the light, and gasped. One of the largest thorns, normally dull and black, was pulsing with a faint crimson light, and at its tip, a tiny droplet of blood was welling up. It was my blood, but it wasn't enough. The need became overwhelming, a ravenous hunger emanating directly from the thorns. My arm throbbed and screamed for something more. That's when I understood. The thorns weren't just growing from my bone. They were rooted in it, connected to my very life force. And they were hungry. I tried to ignore it, to starve them, to pretend they weren't there. But the pain intensified, driving me to the brink of madness. My arm felt like it was on fire, the thorns burrowing deeper, drawing what little strength I had left. I couldn't bear it anymore. Driven by a primal instinct, I pressed my arm against the brick wall of my house. The thorns pierced the skin, drawing a thin line of blood. The relief was instantaneous, a surge of energy coursing through me. The pain subsided, the throbbing quieted, and the thorns drank. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was feeding something monstrous, but the cravings were relentless, the pain unbearable. I became a prisoner of my own flesh, a living garden of bone and thorns, desperate for the crimson sustenance they craved. Now, I live in the shadows, hiding my arm beneath long sleeves, terrified of the monster it has become, the monster I am becoming. I find stray dogs, alley cats, anything to quench the thirst of the thorns. The guilt is a constant companion, gnawing at me alongside the hunger. I call it my bone garden, a twisted, grotesque reminder of a broken bone that never truly healed. And I know with a chilling certainty that it won't be satisfied until it consumes me whole. The only question is, what will it do after? The hollow earth, The rhythmic thump of the drill was the only sound I'd heard for the past 12 hours, a constant pulse against my skull. We were deep, deeper than any team had ever gone before, pushing the limits of Project Colossus, our ambitious attempt to pierce the Earth's mantle. I wiped the sweat from my brow, the mineral tang of the rock already clinging to my skin. "Readings are stable, boss," Ramirez called out, his voice crackling through the comms. Still basalt, but consistency changing. Becoming porous. Porous. That was new. We'd expected a solid, crushing density, the fire-forged heart of the planet testing our drill to its breaking point. Instead, we found porosity. Then the screaming started. It wasn't a human scream. It was a high-pitched, keening wail, echoing through the rock itself. The drill team recoiled, hands clamping over their ears. The metal of the drill housing vibrated violently, amplifying the sound. "Shut it down! Shut it down!" I yelled, battling the rising panic in my own voice. The drill sputtered and died, the silence left in its wake broken only by our ragged breaths and the lingering, fading scream. "What the hell was that?" Miller choked out, his face pale in the harsh light. I forced myself to breathe deeply. "We don't know. Get the cameras online. Now!" The cameras, our eyes into the unknown, whirred to life. They fed back grainy, black and white images to the main monitor. For a moment, all we saw was dust and debris swirling in the confined space of the drill shaft. And then the dust settled. Below, far below, where the drill bit had carved its way through, was a vast, impossible cavern. It was illuminated by a strange, ethereal light, a luminescent glow that seemed to emanate from the very rocks themselves. And within that light, nestled in the bowels of the earth, was a city. Not a primitive village, not a scattering of huts. This was a city of soaring towers and intricate bridges, a metropolis unlike anything I had ever imagined. Its architecture was alien, geometric, and utterly mesmerizing. The structures seemed to defy gravity, reaching upwards with a grace that mocked the crushing weight of the earth above. We were speechless, transfixed by the images unfolding before us. Questions, doubts, and disbelief, all warring for dominance in our minds. How could this be? How could a city exist so deep within the earth? What were the beings that had built it? Then the camera shifted. A tremor ran through the drill shaft, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that resonated through the very core of our being. The camera, jostled by the movement, swung wildly before focusing on the newly drilled opening. Something was climbing up. It was huge, silhouetted against the strange light of the subterranean city. It moved with impossible speed and agility, its limbs scrabbling against the rough walls of the shaft. The camera, trying to compensate for the low light, distorted the image, but the shape was unmistakable. Long limbs, a hunched back, and a head that was wrong. Too large, too many teeth, too many eyes. A collective gasp filled the control room. We were watching something primal, something ancient, something that should not exist. "Seal the shaft," I roared, my voice a strained command. "Seal it now. Flood the chamber." Panic erupted. The team scrambled, hitting switches and slamming levers. We were designed to withstand pressures of thousands of psi, to seal ourselves in and protect the equipment from the crushing force of the mantle. Now, we were using that same safety net against something far more terrifying. The hydraulic pumps whined, and the heavy steel plates began to slide into place, sealing the drill shaft. But the creature was fast. It was almost upon us. The camera, our last window into the abyss, showed a single massive claw extending into the shaft, reaching for the lens. Its surface was covered in jagged scales, glowing with the same eerie light as the city below. Then the image went blank. The steel plates slammed shut, sealing us off from the horror below. We stood there, breathing hard, the silence deafening. We were safe for now, but the images of the city, the scream of the rocks, and the claw reaching for us were burned into our minds. We had broken through, we had seen, and we had awakened something ancient and terrible within the hollow earth. The drill shaft was sealed, flooded, and abandoned. Project Colossus was officially terminated. But I know, and the team knows, that we haven't stopped the thing climbing out. We've only delayed it, because some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. And some secrets, buried deep within the earth, are best left undisturbed. I can only hope that whatever crawled out of that shaft doesn't find its way back to us. Because if it does, I fear for the fate of the world above. The world that now unknowingly shares its planet with something that was never meant to see the light of day. The alien hive, the smoldering crater in my petunia patch, was the first clue. A meteorite, they called it, more like a festering wound ripped in the Earth's face. It was about the size of a small car, black and oily, with veins of pulsing, iridescent green spiderwebbing across its surface. My dog, Buster, a golden retriever with a goofy grin permanently plastered on his face, was fascinated. He wouldn't leave it alone, sniffing and whimpering, his tail thumping a nervous rhythm against his flank. That's when I noticed the tendrils, thin, whip-like things, also pulsing with that eerie green light, writhing from cracks in the meteorite's surface. They looked like living vines, searching for purchase. I tried to drag Buster away, but he was too strong, too fixated. Before I could react, one of the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around his leg like a living snare. I screamed, pulling at the tendril, but it was impossibly strong, burrowing into Buster's fur and disappearing into his skin. He yelped, a high-pitched, terrified sound I'd never heard before. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Buster whined, licking at the spot where the tendril had disappeared, and then, miraculously, seemed fine. I rushed him inside, scrubbing him raw in the tub, convinced I'd gotten rid of whatever alien residue lingered. But that night, the nightmares started. Not mine, Buster's. He whimpered and thrashed in his sleep, low growls rumbling in his chest. I'd wake him, and he'd look at me with eyes that weren't quite his, a disconcerting intelligence flickering beneath the surface of his usual canine confusion. The first sign of change was subtle, a small, pearly white bump on his gums. I dismissed it as a growth, a harmless wart. Then another appeared, and another. Within a day, Buster's mouth was a grotesque landscape of budding teeth, growing haphazardly, jutting out at unnatural angles. They weren't normal teeth either. These were jagged, needle-sharp, alien teeth. That's when the paranoia hit. I started seeing the meteorite everywhere, its reflection in puddles, its oily sheen on the asphalt. I heard the pulsing in my ears at night, a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the walls. I knew with a chilling certainty that whatever had burrowed into Buster was spreading, taking root. He started avoiding me, hiding under the porch or in the darkest corner of the yard. His once friendly demeanor had curdled into something feral. He snapped if I got too close, his eyes burning with a hunger I didn't understand, a hunger that went beyond meat and bone. One evening, I saw it. He was crouched in the shadows beneath the porch, bathed in the eerie green glow emanating from the meteorite. His fur was matted, almost glistening, and then he opened his mouth, not to bark, not to whine, but to reveal a cavernous maw filled not only with the grotesque teeth, but with a pulsating green mass within. It looked like a second mouth, a living hive growing inside him. Fear choked me. This wasn't Buster anymore. This was something else, something alien, something more. He tilted his head, a low growl rumbling from his chest, and I saw the intelligence in his eyes, cold and calculating. He knew I was there, knew I understood. That night, the tendrils came for me. They snaked across the lawn, guided by the pulsating glow of the meteorite, drawn to the life within me. I barricaded myself inside, praying, clutching a rusty baseball bat like a shield. The scratching at the door started subtly. Then it grew more insistent, more frantic. A low, guttural rasping that vibrated through the wood. I knew Buster was out there, or what was left of him. The door splintered. I swung the bat, connecting with something solid. A yelp, not Buster's familiar bark, but a high-pitched, alien shriek. I swung again and again until the scratching stopped. Silence descended. The pulsing of the meteorite seemed louder now, almost mocking. I knew they wouldn't stop. The hive was growing, spreading. Buster was just the beginning. Now I sit here writing this, the pulsing growing stronger, the scratching just beginning on the windows. I can feel the tendrils in the earth, inching closer, probing, searching. I know what they want. They want to connect. They want to grow. I look down at my own hands, searching for the first sign, the first pearly white bump, the first alien bloom. The fear is overwhelming, but beneath it, a chilling fascination. Because deep down, I know the truth. We're not just being invaded. We're being transformed. And maybe, just maybe, that's not such a bad thing. Maybe this is evolution. Maybe this is the alien hive, the sound from space. The static had been a constant companion for years, a white noise blanket against the universe's vast silence. Then, one Tuesday, about halfway through my shift at the Arecibo Observatory, it changed. It wasn't a bang or a whistle or even a coherent message. It was a lullaby, a slow, wavering melody, piped directly from the cosmos into our sophisticated listening devices. It was haunting, delicate, almost painfully sad. Dr. Eris Thorne, head of the project, nearly tripped over his own feet rushing to the control room, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and something akin to religious awe. "Transcribe it," he barked, his voice a strained whisper. "Record everything. Filter out the noise. This is it, people. Contact." It should have been a moment of exhilaration. Decades we'd spent listening, straining, hoping for a sign. And here it was. But the lullaby, it didn't feel like a greeting, felt like a summons. I was one of the first to hear it unfiltered, its alien melody resonating directly in my headsets. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, a pull towards something I couldn't define. And the tune, it was impossibly catchy. It burrowed into my brain, nestled deep within the folds of my memory. That night, I dreamt of an endless, shimmering ocean under a sky painted in hues I'd never seen. I woke up exhausted, the lullaby still echoing in my head. The next day, people started acting strangely. Whispers about sleepwalking circulated through the observatory. At first, it was small things, misplaced tools, coffee brewed at odd hours. Then, Maria, a young intern working on the spectrogram analysis, was found wandering near the edge of the cliff overlooking the coastline. She was humming. Eris dismissed it as stress, the pressure of the discovery getting to people. But the lullaby was growing louder, more insistent. I found myself humming it constantly, even when I tried to focus on other things. The pull intensified, a magnetic force drawing me towards the sea. The truth started to dawn the day we found David. He was one of the engineers, a quiet, unassuming man with a passion for radio waves. They found him on the beach at dawn, knee-deep in the water, still humming. He couldn't explain how he got there, only that he felt compelled. That's when Eris finally admitted something was wrong. He ordered a full shutdown of the receiver array and forbade anyone from listening to the recording. But it was too late. The lullaby was already singing in our heads. The effect had spread beyond the observatory. Local fishermen spoke of a haunting tune carried on the wind, of an irresistible urge to wade into the water. The news started reporting disappearances. People were found drifting further and further out, drawn by an invisible current. I tried to fight it. I locked myself in my apartment, stuffed my ears with cotton, and tried to focus on anything else. But the lullaby was there, a constant undercurrent in my thoughts. It grew fainter when I was distracted, and louder when I was alone. Now, I'm sitting on my balcony, the cool ocean breeze brushing against my skin. The city lights shimmer on the water's surface, mimicking the alien sky from my dream. The cotton is useless, the lullaby a deafening chorus in my head. Eris was right, it was contact, but not of the friendly kind. Something out there is calling to us, drawing us back to the water from whence we came. They're calling me. The pull is almost unbearable. It's a gentle pressure, a comforting embrace. I can almost imagine the cool water caressing my skin, the weightlessness, the peace. I'm humming it now and can't stop. It's a beautiful song, a siren's call from the depths. It's beckoning me home. Just one more step. The black snow. The first flake landed on my eyelash, a feathery tickle of soot. I blinked, expecting it to dissolve like normal snowflakes do in late autumn. But it didn't. It clung, a tiny, inky smear against the fading gold of the afternoon sun. More followed a silent, insidious descent. Black snow. The city shuddered, a collective intake of breath. People stopped, craned their necks, and whispered, "What is it? Volcano? End of days?" I shivered, not from the cold, but from a primal fear that crawled up my spine. I pulled my scarf higher, trying to ward off the falling ash. It was coating everything, transforming the familiar cityscape into a monochrome nightmare. The air tasted acrid, metallic. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the soft, disturbing whispers carried on the wind. That's when I heard mine. It wasn't an audible voice, not exactly. It was a sensation, a thought that burrowed directly into my mind, sharper and clearer than anything I'd ever experienced. It came with the touch of the ash on my skin, a chilling intimacy that felt like an intrusion. "You die tomorrow." The world tilted. My knees buckled. I gripped a lamppost, the cold metal a stark contrast to the burning fear that consumed me. I stared at the black snow clinging to my gloved hand, each flake a tiny messenger of doom. Die tomorrow? How? Why? The questions clawed at my throat, choking me. I was 23, healthy, with a future that, until a few hours ago, stretched before me like a sunlit road. Now, the road ended abruptly, swallowed by the suffocating blackness. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I had to do something. I had to find out why, how, anything. I stumbled towards my apartment, the black snow sticking to my hair, my clothes, whispering its grim prophecy with every touch. Inside, I frantically searched for the news. Nothing. No reports of volcanic eruptions, no warnings, no explanations. Just a city blanketed in a silent, toxic shroud. I called my parents. No answer. My boyfriend, Liam, straight to voicemail. The isolation was crushing, intensified by the chilling certainty of my impending demise. Sleep was impossible. I sat huddled by the window, watching the black snowfall, waiting for answers, hoping for a miracle. The night crawled by agonizingly slow. Every tick of the clock was a step closer to the abyss. As dawn approached, painting the ash-covered sky in shades of gray, I decided to fight. I wouldn't succumb to fear. I wouldn't just sit and wait to die. I armed myself with a plan, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate hope. I would visit Dr. Anya Sharma, a scientist known for her unorthodox theories and her interest in unexplained phenomena. She was a long shot, but she was my only shot. The streets were deserted, buried knee-deep in black snow. The air hung heavy, thick with foreboding. The city was a ghost, a desolate landscape of black and gray. Dr. Sharma's lab was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. The lights were on a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape. When she opened the door, her face was etched with exhaustion and worry. "I know why you're here," she said, her voice raspy. "The ash, it speaks to people." I told her about the prophecy, the chilling certainty of my death. She listened intently, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and fascination. "The ash is a carrier," she explained. "It carries information, memories, maybe even destiny. It seems you've been chosen. Why, I don't know, but we might be able to find out." She led me to a complex machine humming with energy. "This device can analyze the ash, extract the information it carries. It's experimental, but it's our only chance." The process was long and arduous. Dr. Sharma worked tirelessly, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. Hours passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't understand," she stammered. "The ash isn't predicting your death. It's reflecting it. It's showing you what would have happened if you hadn't changed your plans." Confused, I pressed her for details. "You were supposed to be on Flight 309 to Chicago this morning. That flight, it crashed. There were no survivors. The world swam. The black snow outside the window seemed to fade, replaced by the blinding light of understanding. I wasn't meant to die tomorrow. I was meant to die today. The prophecy wasn't a death sentence. It was a warning. The black snow still fell, but it no longer whispered of doom. It whispered of survival, of a second chance. I had cheated death, and now I had a life to live, a future to build, a debt to repay. The black snow had been a curse, yes, but also a strange, twisted blessing, and I wouldn't waste it. The skin shedding. The first flake was small, almost unnoticeable. I dismissed it as dry skin, a consequence of the harsh winter. But then came another, and another, drifting from my arms like dandelion seeds in a summer breeze. Lotion didn't help. Exfoliation only made it worse. The flakes became larger and thicker, taking on a peculiar opalescence, a shimmering sheen that caught the light. Panic set in when I ran my hand over my forearm and felt something wrong. Not the smooth, yielding flesh I was accustomed to, but a subtle ridge, a hinting of something hard beneath the peeling skin. Dr. Albright, a man whose bedside manner was as dry as my shedding skin, ran a battery of tests. He poked, prodded, and took more blood than seemed humanly possible. After a week of agonizing waiting, he called me in. "Well, Mr. Evans," he said, adjusting his glasses and peering at me over the rim, "the results are unusual." Unusual? My skin was falling off like a molting reptile. I could practically feel the scales forming underneath. Unusual? That was an understatement. We've ruled out any known dermatological conditions, autoimmune diseases, even exotic infections. There's no explanation for the shedding. However, he paused, his gaze intense. The cellular analysis is fascinating. There's a discernible shift in your genetic makeup, Mr. Evans. A prehistoric component. He cleared his throat. We're calling it accelerated evolution. Essentially, your body is adapting to something. We just don't know what. Evolution. The word hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. Evolution was supposed to take millennia, not weeks. Evolution wasn't supposed to involve itchy, flaking skin and the growing suspicion that I was turning into something else. The scales spread. First my arms, then my legs creeping up my neck. They were small, hexagonal, a deep emerald green that shimmered under the light. I spent hours in front of the mirror, tracing their contours with my fingertips, feeling the cold, alien texture. I tried to hide them under long sleeves and high collars, but the fear was a living thing, burrowing under my skin, deeper than the scales. The physical changes were unsettling, but the psychological ones were worse. My appetite shifted. Salads and pasta, once staples, now left me feeling nauseous. I craved protein, dense and raw. I dreamt of hunting, of stalking prey under the moonlight. My senses heightened, my instincts sharp. Then came the night I woke up in the middle of the night, driven by an insatiable hunger. I stumbled to the kitchen, the moonlight glinting off the scales on my arms. My hand brushed against the butcher block counter. I saw the package of steaks I had bought earlier that day, intended for a barbecue I'd now never host. Without thinking, I tore open the plastic. The smell of raw meat assaulted my nostrils, a primal, intoxicating scent. I picked up a steak, the cold, bloody flesh slick in my hand. Hesitantly, I brought it to my mouth. The taste was extraordinary. Not the bland, processed taste of cooked meat, but something wild and untamed. My teeth tore through the fibers, the blood coating my tongue. I devoured the entire steak in minutes, the hunger a ravenous beast that finally felt sated. As I wiped the blood from my lips with the back of my hand, a shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't me. This wasn't the man I knew. This was something primal, something instinctual, something reptilian. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The moonlight bathed my face in an eerie glow, highlighting the emerald scales that now traced the line of my jaw. Was I still human, or was I becoming something else? Something that craved raw meat and dreamt of hunting under the moonlight? The doctor called it evolution, but I knew it was more than that. It was a transformation, a terrifying descent into something unknown. And as I looked at the reflection, I saw a flicker of something ancient in my eyes, a spark of something that had been dormant for millennia, now awakening within me. The shedding had just begun. The last house on the block. The paint was peeling, a sickly yellow that clashed horribly with the encroaching dusk. Grass, knee-high in places, choked the once manicured lawn. But Maya and Ben had been too blinded by the price tag, too weary of cramped city apartments, to notice the obvious signs. Charming fixer-upper, the realtor Mrs. Gable had called it, her smile a tight, unsettling mask. Needs a little love, but the bones are good. Mrs. Gable neglected to mention the house's reputation. They only learned about that from a gossiping neighbor, a wizened woman named Agnes, 2 weeks after moving in. The last house on the block, Agnes had cackled, her eyes glinting with morbid delight. No one stays alive there for more than a year. Bad luck, they say. Bad luck indeed. Maya tried to dismiss it as a small-town superstition. Ben, ever the pragmatist, suggested a structural survey. But the unsettling feeling in Maya's gut wouldn't dissipate. It clung to her like the humid southern air, thick and suffocating. The first incident was subtle, a misplaced teacup, a door that creaked open in the middle of the night. Then came the whispers, faint, rustling sounds that seemed to emanate from within the walls. Ben, exhausted from his commute and the endless repairs, dismissed them as drafts or the old house settling. But Maya knew better. One evening, while painting the living room, a valiant attempt to cover the offensive yellow, Maya heard it again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, hushed and mournful, repeating a single word, "Run, run, run." She threw down her brush, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Ben, did you hear that?" Ben, perched precariously on a ladder sanding the window frame, sighed. "Hear what, Maya? You're imagining things. The house is just talking." That night, Maya couldn't sleep. She lay rigid in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the house. She swore she could feel eyes on her, watching her from the darkness. The next day, armed with Agnes's cryptic warning and a growing sense of dread, Maya decided to investigate. She started with the attic, a dusty, cluttered space filled with forgotten relics, moth-eaten furniture, chipped china dolls with vacant eyes, and a stack of yellowed newspapers dating back to the 1950s. As she sifted through the newspapers, a headline caught her eye. "Tragedy strikes Miller family." The accompanying article described a brutal murder-suicide. John Miller, driven mad by financial ruin, had killed his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Emily, before turning the gun on himself. The house, the article stated, had been vacant ever since. A chill ran down Maya's spine. This wasn't just an old house. It was a tomb. Suddenly, she heard a scratching sound. It was coming from behind the wall, a rhythmic, fingernail on chalkboard screech that made her teeth ache. Fear propelled her forward. She pressed her ear against the wall, listening intently. The scratching stopped, replaced by a raspy whisper. "We are still here." Terrified, Maya stumbled back, knocking over a pile of old books. One of them fell open, revealing a faded photograph. A smiling woman with kind eyes looked back at her. Sarah Miller. That night, Maya confronted Ben. She showed him the newspaper clippings, the photograph. He was skeptical until he too started hearing the whispers. He started seeing shadows flitting in the periphery, feeling cold spots in otherwise warm rooms. They tried everything, smudging with sage, calling a priest, even a paranormal investigator. But nothing worked. The presence inside the walls only grew stronger, more malevolent. One evening, Ben was working late in the den, trying to make sense of the property taxes. Maya was in the kitchen, frantically packing a suitcase. She knew they had to leave. Now, suddenly the lights flickered and died. The house was plunged into darkness. Maya gasped, her heart pounding. From the den, she heard Ben scream. She grabbed a flashlight and raced towards the sound. She found Ben huddled in the corner, his face pale with terror. They were touching me, he stammered, pointing towards the walls, trying to pull me in. Maya shone the flashlight beam around the room. The wallpaper was peeling away, revealing dark, gaping cracks that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. She could hear the whispers, louder now, swirling around them like a vortex. "Run!" she screamed, grabbing Ben's hand. They bolted for the front door, fumbling with the deadbolt. As they finally wrenched it open, they saw them, the Millers. Their translucent forms flickered in the doorway, their eyes filled with an eternal, agonizing sadness. John Miller raised a spectral hand, his face twisted in a rictus of despair. "You can't leave," he rasped. "This is our home." Maya slammed the door shut, dragging Ben behind her. They ran, not stopping until they reached the edge of the property, gasping for breath beneath the cold, uncaring stars. They never went back. They sold the house for a fraction of what they paid for it, content to cut their losses. Years later, Maya still has nightmares about the Millers, their silent suffering etched into her memory. The last house on the block remains vacant, a silent testament to the horrors that reside within. And the whispers still echo in the walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting family to move in, unaware that they're not just buying a house, but inheriting a tragedy. The Millers are still there, trapped, forever bound to the walls, and they're always looking for company. The hospital's secret wing. The elevator chimed, a jarringly cheerful sound in the sterile silence of St. Jude's. I was exhausted, the end of a double shift weighing heavily on my shoulders. "B1, I mumbled to myself, fumbling for the button. My thumb slipped. B13. I frowned. B13 wasn't on any of the hospital maps. It wasn't listed in the emergency directory. I'd worked here for 5 years, and I'd never heard a single soul mention AB13. Curiosity, a dangerous thing in my line of work, won out. I pressed the button. The doors slid shut, and the elevator hummed into motion. The familiar rhythmic whir began, but then it changed. The hum deepened, vibrating through the floor. The lights flickered, casting elongated, distorted shadows in the mirrored walls. A wave of nausea washed over me, a cold sweat prickling my skin. The elevator lurched to a stop. The doors groaned open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that reeked of antiseptic and something else, something acrid and metallic that clung to the back of my throat. This was not St. Jude's. The walls were bare concrete, stained with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. The air hung thick and heavy, suffocating. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. Down the hallway, I saw them. Rows of beds, each occupied by a figure strapped down with thick leather restraints. Their eyes were wide, filled with abject terror. Some were babbling incoherently, others sobbing quietly. But one phrase rose above the cacophony of fear, a desperate plea repeated again and again. "Don't let it take you too." I started to back away, my heart hammering against my ribs. What it was, I didn't want to know. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hallway. Tall and gaunt, clad in a stained white coat, they moved with an unnatural, gliding grace. Their face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel their gaze on me, heavy and intense. They raised a hand, beckoning me forward. "Welcome," a voice rasped, a dry, crackling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "We've been expecting you." My legs were frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was trapped, caught in the suffocating grip of something profoundly wrong. One of the patients, a woman with matted hair and bruised arms, screamed at me, "Get out! Get out while you still can. Don't listen to him. He'll make you one of us." The doctor, or whatever he was, chuckled, a low, guttural sound that echoed in the hallway. "Nonsense," he said, his voice laced with a chilling amusement. "We simply offer a unique form of treatment here, a chance to transcend the limitations of the mortal coil." He began to walk towards me, his steps slow and deliberate. I finally found my voice, a shaky whisper. What do you do here?" He stopped a few feet away, and the shadows shifted, revealing a glimpse of his face. It was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and black, filled with an unholy light. "We cure," he said, stretching the word out, making it sound obscene. "We cure the disease of mortality." He reached out a hand, his fingers long and skeletal. I flinched back, pressing myself against the elevator doors. The doors remained stubbornly closed. "Come now," he said, his voice softening, becoming almost persuasive. "Don't be afraid. We only want to help you see the truth." That was when I noticed it, a glint of metal in his hand, a syringe filled with a viscous, black liquid that pulsed with an unnatural light. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my fist against the elevator buttons, mashing them all in a desperate frenzy. The doors groaned, sputtered, and finally, miraculously, began to close. As the gap narrowed, I saw the doctor's face, contorted in a mask of rage and disappointment, and I saw the eyes of the patients, filled with a desperate, pleading hope. The doors slammed shut, the elevator shuddered, and I felt myself being pulled upwards, away from the horror of B13. When the doors opened back on the familiar, brightly lit floor of the hospital, I stumbled out, gasping for air. My clothes were damp with sweat, my hands trembling. I ran to the nurse's station, my heart still pounding in my chest. "There's a B13, I stammered. "A secret wing. Strapped patients. A doctor." The nurse looked at me strangely, a mixture of concern and pity in her eyes. "Honey, you've had a tough shift. Go home and get some rest. There's no B13. You're imagining things." I insisted, I pleaded. I showed them the elevator, pointed to the button. They searched the maps, checked the blueprints. B13 did not exist. They attributed it to exhaustion, to stress. They suggested therapy. But I knew what I had seen. I knew the horror that lay hidden beneath St. Jude's. Now I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces and hear their pleas. Don't let it take you too. I walk the hallways of St. Jude's, always listening, always watching. I know he's still down there, waiting. And I know, with a chilling certainty, that he's not finished with me yet. Because the secret wing of St. Jude's doesn't just take you. It calls you back. And one day I fear I will answer. The factory of screams. The air in Ashton Creek always held a certain weight. It wasn't just the humidity that clung to your skin, but a heavier, cloying feeling, a residue of something dreadful. That weight emanated from the abandoned textile mill at the edge of town, a hulking brick behemoth that cast a perpetual shadow over everything. Everyone knew about the whispers surrounding the mill, how it closed down in the dead of night, leaving behind bolts of unfinished fabric and, more unsettlingly, rumors of missing workers. How the machines inside were said to still hum, fueled by some unknown power, churning out cloth woven from other things. Mostly, they said, human hair. I dismissed it for years as small-town folklore, the kind of spooky story that got passed down around campfires. But the stories had been getting louder lately, more insistent. And then, last night, it happened. I live in a cottage on the outskirts of Ashton Creek, close enough to hear the low thrum of the mill on still nights. Last night was still, almost unnervingly so. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it. A rhythmic, mechanical clatter, the distinct sound of a loom working at full speed. Then, a voice, thin and reedy, emerged from the rhythm. A voice that whispered, clear as a bell, "Eliza, Eliza, Eliza." My blood ran cold. Eliza, that was my name. I sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering against my ribs. Moonlight streamed through the window, painting the room in a spectral glow. The sound was still there, the rhythmic clatter punctuated by the chilling whisper of my name. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a creeping dread, I stumbled out of bed and pulled on my boots. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam a puny defense against the darkness that pressed in, and set off towards the mill. The air grew colder as I approached, the smell of damp earth and something else, something acrid and metallic, filling my nostrils. The mill loomed before me, a monstrous silhouette against the inky sky. I could hear the low hum of the machinery now, a relentless, throbbing drone that vibrated through the ground and into my bones. The main entrance was boarded up, but I knew of a broken window around the back, a point of entry for generations of daredevil kids and urban explorers. I squeezed through the gap, shards of glass crunching under my feet. The interior was a labyrinth of shadows and rusting machinery. Gargoyle-like shapes loomed in the darkness, their purpose now lost to time. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. The hum was deafening now, a symphony of churning metal and unseen power. As I ventured deeper, I noticed traces of activity. Footprints in the dust, the lingering scent of oil, and a single, flickering gas lamp illuminating a section of the factory floor. It was casting long, dancing shadows on the looms. I moved towards the light, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The looms were enormous, intricate contraptions, their shuttles darting back and forth with unnerving speed. And they were weaving. The fabric they produced was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was a shimmering, almost iridescent material, shot through with strands of silver that seemed to catch and reflect the light. And woven into the fabric with an almost unbearable clarity were strands of human hair. Brown hair, blonde hair, red hair, all interwoven into the macabre tapestry. Then I saw it. On one of the looms, a section of fabric still in production was displaying a pattern I recognized. A swirling, intricate design, unmistakably my own. A birthmark I carried on my left shoulder, perfectly rendered in strands of dark brown hair. The voice returned, louder now, closer. "Eliza, Eliza, we need your thread, Eliza." Panic seized me. I didn't understand, but I knew I had to get out. I turned to flee, but saw a figure standing in the shadows, its face obscured by the darkness. It was tall and gaunt, with long skeletal fingers. It held a pair of rusty shears. "Come, Eliza," the figure rasped. "Join the weave." I screamed and lunged back through the broken window, scrambling out into the night. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the machines accelerating, churning faster and faster, the voice chanting my name, growing louder, more insistent. I ran all the way back to my cottage, not stopping until I slammed the door shut and bolted it tight. I huddled in the corner, listening to the thrum of the mill, the chanting voice, the relentless rhythm of the looms. I haven't slept since. I keep the lights on, all the lights, and I can still hear it. The hum, the chant, the sound of my name being woven into the fabric of the nightmare. I know they're still there in the factory of screams, waiting for me, waiting for my thread, and I fear that one day they'll get it. The diner at the edge of nowhere. The bell above the door chimed a rusty, dissonant clang that cut through the crackle of the static-filled radio. I stepped inside, relief washing over me in a wave of greasy warmth. The diner at the edge of nowhere. Fitting, I thought, burying my hands deeper in my pockets. My car had coughed its last ragged breath about an hour back, leaving me stranded on this desolate stretch of highway with nothing but wind and the growing anxiety of the encroaching night. The aroma of frying bacon and stale coffee hung heavy in the air, a strange comfort after the biting chill outside. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, their surfaces worn smooth with countless anonymous elbows. The counter was cluttered with chipped mugs and stacks of well-thumbed menus. A lone waitress, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag that had seen better decades. She was thin, almost skeletal, and her eyes, a startling shade of blue, seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 untold stories. "Just you tonight," she said, her voice raspy. "Have a seat anywhere you like." I picked the booth furthest from the door, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. As I slid in, I noticed the other occupants of the diner. 3 of them, all men, sat hunched over their coffee cups in a booth in the back. They wore heavy, dark coats, and their faces were obscured by the shadows of their hats. But what struck me, chilled me to the bone, was their eyes, or rather the lack thereof. Where their eyes should have been, there was only smooth, unblemished skin. I quickly looked away, pretending to study the menu. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was wrong. Everything about this place felt profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. The waitress returned, her blue eyes scrutinizing me. "What'll it be, hon?" "Just coffee," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "And maybe directions to the nearest town?" She poured the coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the chipped mug. "Don't bother with directions, hon. You won't find anything for miles." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "And this coffee, it never cools. Don't try to make it. And don't stay past midnight." "Why?" The word escaped my lips before I could stop it. She straightened up, her expression unreadable. "Just trust me. It's for your own good." I took a tentative sip of the coffee. She was right. It was scalding hot, yet the mug didn't feel overly warm to the touch. It was an unsettling sensation. I glanced back at the men in the back. Despite their lack of eyes, I could feel their gaze on me. It was a heavy, oppressive presence. I spent the next few hours in a state of growing dread. The radio continued to crackle and hiss, playing static between snippets of forgotten songs. The waitress moved silently and efficiently, refilling coffee cups and wiping down the counter. I tried to read a dog-eared paperback I found in my backpack, but the words swam before my eyes. I kept stealing glances at the eyeless men. They hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but their presence was a constant, unnerving pressure. As the hands of the ancient clock on the wall crept closer to midnight, I made my decision. I couldn't stay. Whatever these people were, whatever this place was, it was not safe. I stood up, knocking my chair over in my haste. The sound echoed in the unnaturally quiet diner. The men in the back turned their eyeless faces towards me. I felt a wave of nausea. I need to go, I stammered, fumbling in my pocket for my wallet. The waitress stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You can't leave, Han," she said, her voice now a low, almost hypnotic drone. "Not yet. I have to," I insisted, pushing past her. As I reached for the door, the men in the back stood up. They moved with a fluid, unsettling grace, their coats swirling around them like dark shrouds. Panic clawed at my throat. I wrenched open the door and stumbled out into the night. The wind howled, carrying the scent of dust and something else, something acrid and unsettling. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran as fast as I could. The image of those eyeless faces seared into my mind. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed. I don't know how long I ran or where I ran to. I just kept moving, driven by the primal instinct to survive. Eventually, I collapsed on the side of the road, exhausted and terrified. When I woke, the sun was high in the sky. My car was there, sitting on the shoulder, completely intact. I stared at it, disoriented. Had it all been a dream? I got in, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. In the distance, I could see the faint shimmer of heat rising from the asphalt. And for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the outline of a diner, a lonely beacon at the edge of nowhere. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I still feel that weight, that eyeless gaze, and I remember the waitress's warning, "Don't stay past midnight," because the diner at the edge of nowhere is always waiting, hungry for new souls to join its silent, eyeless patrons. And its coffee never cools. The Motel of Lost Souls. The sign was a mangled mockery of neon, sputtering a sickly green that painted the deserted highway in an eerie glow. The Stardust Motel, it choked, half the letters extinguished, the rest hinting at a bygone era of roadside glamour. I was beyond caring. My car was coughing its last. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, and the gnawing fatigue threatened to swallow me whole. The office was deserted, save for a dust-covered bell on the counter and the faint smell of stale cigarettes. I rang it, the sound echoing through the silence like a gunshot. A man shambled out from the back, his face etched with the weariness of a life lived in the quiet desperation of forgotten places. "Room?" he croaked, his voice raspy as sandpaper. "Anything available?" I asked, my voice equally tired. He glanced at a ledger thicker than a dictionary, its pages filled with faded ink. "Room 13's open," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "Always is. Room 13. Even in my weary state, a prickle of unease ran down my spine. Room 13 always open. Classic horror trope. Still, beggars can't be choosers. "Fine," I said, taking the key he offered. It was heavy, cold, and strangely ornate for such a dilapidated place. The room was exactly as I expected. Musty, threadbare, and furnished with the bare essentials. A lumpy bed, a stained armchair, and a chipped dresser adorned with a large, antique mirror. The air hung heavy with a sense of unease. I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to exhaustion, and collapsed onto the bed. I woke with a start, tangled in the scratchy sheets. The room was darker than before, the only light filtering in from the highway, painting long, distorted shadows on the walls. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed something wrong. The mirror, it seemed to hum with a faint, ethereal energy. I walked towards it, drawn in by an invisible force. My reflection stared back, but it wasn't alone. Faces flickered within the glass, ephemeral and tormented. Eyes wide with terror pleaded with me. Mouths opened in silent screams. They were trapped. "Help us!" A woman's voice whispered, barely audible. It seemed to emanate from the mirror itself. I recoiled in horror. The faces pressed closer, their spectral hands reaching out, their silent pleas growing more desperate. A man with a handlebar mustache and a bowler hat, a young girl with pigtails and a tear-streaked face, a stern-looking woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun. They were all there, trapped within the reflective prison. "What do you want?" I stammered, my voice shaking. "Release us!" Another voice cried, this one male, deep and guttural. "We're stuck here. We can't escape." They poured out their stories in fragmented whispers. They had all stayed in room 13 years ago, decades ago. They had all been drawn to the mirror, and they had all been trapped. Their souls, their memories, their very essence, sucked into the glass, forever bound to the Stardust Motel. Panic clawed at my throat. I understood now why room 13 was always vacant. No one could stay there, not without being consumed. The faces in the mirror grew more insistent, their pleas turning to desperate demands. "Break the mirror," one of them screamed. "Shatter it. It's the only way." The idea was terrifying, reckless, but what choice did I have? I was surrounded by ghosts, trapped in a nightmare, and the only way out seemed to be to destroy the very thing holding them captive. I snatched the heavy iron lamp from the bedside table and raised it above my head. The spectral faces in the mirror watched, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and terror. Taking a deep breath, I swung the lamp with all my might. The mirror shattered, unleashing a blinding flash of light and a cacophony of screams. Shards of glass rained down around me, reflecting the distorted image of the decaying room. Then silence. I stood there, panting, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was still, the air no longer heavy with dread. The only sound was the gentle hiss of passing cars on the highway. Had I freed them? Had I destroyed them? Couldn't tell. The mirror was in pieces, its secrets buried beneath the wreckage. I fled the Stardust Motel before dawn, leaving the broken mirror and the ghosts it held behind. I never looked back, but sometimes, late at night, when I catch my reflection in a darkened window, I see them there, behind me, their faces still searching, still pleading. And I wonder, have I truly escaped the Motel of Lost Souls? Or am I just the next guest waiting to be trapped? The heartbeat in the walls. The old Victorian had called to me like a siren song. It was dilapidated, sure, with peeling paint and a garden choked with weeds. But the bones were good. High ceilings, intricate molding, a wraparound porch begging for a swing. It was everything I'd ever wanted. And the price? Unbelievably low. The realtor, a slick-haired man named Mr. Henderson, had rambled about motivated sellers and a need for extensive renovations. But I'd been too blinded by the potential to ask the right questions. I should have asked about Mrs. Abernathy. The first sign was the rhythm, a slow, steady thrum, like a slumbering giant's heartbeat. It vibrated through the floorboards, pulsed in the window panes, throbbed in the very air I breathed. I dismissed it as old pipes, the house settling, anything but the unease that clawed at the edges of my mind. Then came the stain. The day I tried to leave for work, a crimson bloom spread across the wall beside the front door. It wasn't painted, not exactly. It was viscous and thick, and the metallic tang filled my nostrils with a sickeningly familiar scent. Blood, fresh blood. Panic seized me. I grabbed my phone, but the connection was dead. I wrenched open the door, only to find the stain expanding, flowing like a tide to block my escape. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my denial. I was trapped. Days bled into weeks. The heartbeat grew stronger, more insistent, dominating the silence. The stains multiplied, creeping up the walls, staining the carpets. They seemed to react to my attempts to leave, blossoming with renewed ferocity. I was a prisoner in my dream home, haunted by a presence I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. One evening, driven to the edge of desperation, I tore at the wallpaper in the dining room, looking for the source. Behind the floral print, a single word was etched into the plaster: Agatha. Agatha, a name slammed against the walls of my memory. Mr. Henderson, during the closing, had stammered something about the previous owner. A very private woman. She passed away recently. Quietly, he'd failed to mention that she had died in the house, that she had never left. I started to research Agatha Abernathy. Old newspaper clippings spoke of a recluse, a woman obsessed with her home, a woman who had vanished without a trace. Nobody was ever found. The obvious dawned on me slowly, a horrifying realization chilling me to the bone. Agatha hadn't vanished. She had become the house. Her life force, her personality, her obsession had infused the very walls, the floors, the foundation. She was the heartbeat, the blood, the force that kept me captive. I tried to reason with her, speaking aloud in the empty rooms, begging her to let me go. Agatha, I pleaded, I just want to live here. I'll take care of your home. Just let me leave when I need to. The only response was a stronger, more desperate pulse, and a new stain blossoming on the ceiling above me. I realized then that she wasn't just protecting her home. She was lonely, desperately, impossibly lonely, and she wanted company. The decision was a terrifying gamble, but I had no other choice. I stopped fighting. I stopped trying to leave. Instead, I started talking to her. I told her about my day, about my dreams, about the things I wanted to do with the house. I watered her overgrown garden, carefully tending to the neglected roses. I polished the antique furniture, whispering stories of their previous owners. Slowly, subtly, things began to change. The heartbeat softened, becoming a gentler rhythm. The stains, though still present, seemed less angry. One morning, I even managed to walk to the mailbox without triggering a crimson flood. Agatha was still here, I knew that. I could feel her presence in the quiet corners of the house. But she wasn't a captor anymore. She was a roommate. I'm still living in the Victorian. It's taken years, but the walls are almost clean. The garden is thriving. I even have friends over now. They can't feel the heartbeat, of course, and they never ask about the faint, lingering scent of iron and roses. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the moon is full, I think I can hear her whisper, not in words, but in the sigh of the wind through the ancient trees, in the creak of the floorboards under my feet, and in the steady, comforting thrum that echoes through the walls. I hear a lonely heart finding peace. I hear the house breathing, a home finally shared. the eye infection. The first sign was a gritty feeling like sand perpetually trapped under my eyelid. I rubbed it, splashed water, and then tried a saline solution, but the irritation persisted. Then came the photosensitivity. Sunlight became knives, and even the soft glow of a lamp sent daggers of pain through my skull. But the real horror started with the discoloration. It began as a subtle darkening, a bruised hue around the corner of my left eye. I chalked it up to lack of sleep, stress, anything but the truth. Within days, however, the change was undeniable. My once clear hazel iris had become a swirling vortex of obsidian, a stark contrast to the normal brown of my right eye. Dr. Albright was baffled. He ran tests, consulted colleagues, and even considered sending me to a specialist in ocular anomalies. "It's unprecedented," he admitted, peering through his ophthalmoscope. "The pressure's normal, the retina's intact. It's just black." He prescribed antibiotics, steroids, and a healthy dose of skepticism. But the antibiotics did nothing. The steroids only masked the symptoms slightly. And the skepticism crumbled the first time I looked in the mirror and saw, not my bathroom, but something else. Through my left eye, the familiar porcelain sink was coated in a thin layer of grime, crawling with insects I couldn't identify. The mirror reflected not my face, contorted in fear, but a warped and decaying version of it, teeth elongated into fangs, skin peeling back to reveal the skull beneath. Panic choked me. I slammed the medicine cabinet shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a hallucination, a nightmare, a cruel joke played by my frayed nerves. But with each blink, the alternate reality bled into my vision, a terrifying overlay on the mundane world. My living room, normally a haven of comfortable furniture and warm light, became a festering pit. The plush sofa was torn and ragged, infested with writhing, maggot-like things. The television screen showed static interspersed with glimpses of skeletal faces, their empty sockets burning with malevolent glee. And then I realized they could see me. Started as a prickling sensation, a feeling of being watched. I would catch glimpses of shadowy figures lurking at the edges of my vision, just beyond the periphery of my left eye. They were gaunt and emaciated, their bodies twisted into unnatural shapes. They had no eyes, just gaping holes that seemed to drink in the darkness. One night, I was sitting on the couch, trying to ignore the horrors flooding my left eye, when I felt a cold, clammy hand on my arm. I screamed, flailing wildly, but when I looked, my right eye saw nothing, just the familiar texture of the sofa's armrest. My left eye, however, saw the hand retracting, leaving a trail of viscous, black slime on the fabric. They wanted something, or perhaps they wanted me. Sleep became a battleground. I tried to keep my left eye closed, but the visions persisted, leaking through my eyelids like a toxic sludge. In my dreams, I was dragged into their world, a landscape of rotting flesh and shattered bone, where I was hunted and tormented by the eyeless horrors. Driven to the brink of madness, I considered drastic measures, gouging out the infected eye, removing the source of this terrifying affliction. But something held me back, a morbid curiosity, perhaps, or a desperate hope that there was some way to understand what was happening. Then one day I noticed a change. The blackness in my eye wasn't just spreading, it was solidifying. The swirling vortex had begun to form a distinct pupil, a dark, unwavering pinpoint in the center of the obsidian. And through that pupil, I saw not just the decaying world, but something else. knowledge. I saw fragments of their history, their suffering, their twisted existence. They were trapped, bound to this decaying reality, and they saw me as a potential escape. My left, I was a bridge, a doorway to a world they could reach, a world they could infect. And I was their key. Now, I understand what I must do. I can't gouge out my eye. That would only leave them stranded, desperate. Instead, I must find a way to sever the connection, to close the doorway before they can fully cross over. The question is, how? The infection is spreading. The visions are stronger. The eyeless figures are closer. I can feel them reaching out, their cold, clammy hands brushing against my skin, their voiceless whispers resonating in my mind. I'm running out of time, and with each passing day, I fear I'm becoming less me and more them. The hair. The first time it happened, I woke gasping, a fine web of hair clinging to my face, tickling my nose. I brushed it away, blaming it on dust bunnies or rogue cat fur. I own a Persian, after all, but it happened again the next night and the next. Each time, the web thickened, the strands heavier, stickier somehow. It was then I noticed the length. My normally shoulder-length hair was cascading down my back, pooling around me on the bed. I hacked at it with nail scissors, frustrated and bewildered. That night, the hair was back, longer than before. Panic began to set in. I tried everything. Wigs, hats, scarves. Nothing could contain it. The hair grew, relentless and insidious, spilling out of my confinement and sneaking down my back. At work, I wore a bulky turban, praying no one would notice the strange, thick tendrils peeking out from beneath the folds. The worst part wasn't the length, though. It was the sensation, a constant, crawling feeling on my scalp, like ants carrying tiny burdens. And then the whispers started. First, I thought I was going insane. A low, sibilant murmur, barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator. Then, one night, as the hair tightened around my neck, a clear, distinct whisper. "We're almost free." My blood ran cold. Free from what? Me? Was my hair sentient? I began to research. Ancient myths, medical anomalies, anything that could explain what was happening to me. I stumbled upon obscure tales of hair as a symbol of power, of strength, of connection to the earth, and darker stories of hair possessed, of hair imbued with the spirits of the dead. The more I learned, the more terrified I became. The hair was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a parasite, a force with its own agenda, using me as a vessel. Sleep became a torturous battle. Every night, the hair would grow bolder, thicker, wrapping itself around my throat, its weight pressing down on my chest. I fought it with scissors, with razors, with anything I could find. But it always came back, stronger, longer, hungrier. One night, I woke to a chilling sensation. The hair was no longer just on my head. Thick, black strands were sprouting from my arms, my legs, my torso. I looked in the mirror, and a scream caught in my throat. My reflection was distorted, a grotesque caricature, almost completely obscured by the writhing, whispering mass. "We're almost free," the hair whispered in unison, a chorus of sibilant malice. "Soon we will be one." I knew what they meant. They wanted to consume me entirely, to erase my identity, to become me. Desperate, I remembered an old legend, a ritual to sever the connection between the body and the parasitic growth. It involved fire, a sacrifice of sorts. I didn't know if it was true, but I was running out of options. I gathered my courage, soaked a cloth in kerosene, and held it to my head. The smell was acrid, suffocating. I hesitated, fear warring with desperation. Then I braced myself and struck a match. The flames erupted, licking at the cloth and engulfing my hair. The pain was excruciating, but I held on, chanting the words from the ancient text, a desperate prayer for freedom. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. The hair writhed and thrashed, trying to escape the flames. The air filled with the stench of burning hair and flesh. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The whispering ceased. The flames subsided, leaving behind a charred husk. I collapsed, weak and trembling, the smell of burning still clinging to me. I looked in the mirror. My head was bald, my skin scorched, but something was different. The weight, the crawling sensation, the whispers, they were gone. I was free, but as I stared at my reflection, at the raw, burned flesh that peeked through the sparse remains of my eyebrows, I couldn't shake a lingering feeling of unease. I knew the ritual had worked, but had it truly destroyed the hair, or had it simply been forced back, dormant, waiting for the opportune moment to reemerge? As I touched my scalp, feeling the smooth, bare skin beneath my fingers, I couldn't help but wonder, what happens when it starts to grow again? The teeth. The first one went without much fanfare. I was mid-bite into a particularly chewy piece of sourdough when I felt a wiggle, then a pop. I spat it into my hand, expecting to see a piece of crust, but it was a molar root intact, tinged a disturbing shade of gray. Stress, the dentist said, examining the gaping hole in my mouth. You're grinding your teeth at night. We'll get you a mouth guard. I nodded, relieved. Grinding my teeth was a manageable problem. I bought the mouth guard, wore it religiously, and tried to de-stress with chamomile tea and nature documentaries. But a week later, another molar followed, this time while I was simply talking. The dentist was less reassuring this time. He ordered x-rays, blood work, and muttered things I didn't quite catch about bone density and rare genetic anomalies. Everything came back normal. Then the new tooth erupted. It wasn't a molar, not like the ones it replaced. This one was sharp, serrated, almost predatory. A vicious little thing that felt alien in my mouth. It sliced against my tongue, drawing a bead of blood. See another specialist, the dentist mumbled, shuffling me out the door with a prescription for painkillers. But before I could find a specialist, another old molar gave up the ghost, replaced by another, equally terrifying, tooth. My mouth was becoming a landscape of jagged edges, a testament to something wrong. And the hunger started. It began as a low, persistent growl in my stomach, easily ignored. But it escalated. It gnawed, clawed. I tried everything. Steak, pasta, pizza, salads, even the disgustingly sweet protein shakes marketed towards bodybuilders. Nothing filled the void. The mirror became my enemy. My eyes were sunken, ringed with shadows. My skin was pale, but it was my mouth that truly horrified me. A row of gleaming, predatory teeth was taking over. They seemed to vibrate with an insatiable need. I tried to ignore it, to fight it. I locked myself in my apartment, curtains drawn, refusing to look at food. But the hunger became a screaming beast inside me, a ravenous monster fueled by an unknown source. One evening, I was watching television, a nature documentary ironically showing a pack of wolves tearing into a carcass. When it happened, the hunger overwhelmed me. My control snapped. I felt an almost primal urge, a desperate need to something. I stumbled to the kitchen, drawn by an invisible force. My gaze landed on the raw chicken I'd planned to cook for dinner. I grabbed it, the cold flesh sending a shiver through me, and I ate it raw. The texture was unpleasant, the taste metallic and unfamiliar, but the hunger, for the first time in weeks, subsided. Not completely, but enough to quiet the screaming. I stared at the mangled remains of the chicken, horrified. What was happening to me? I scrubbed the blood from my hands. The image of my serrated teeth tearing into the raw flesh branded into my mind. The next day, the hunger returned, fiercer than ever. The leftover chicken wasn't enough. I went out, drawn by the same invisible force. I found myself in a butcher shop, staring at a hanging side of beef. The butcher, a kind-faced man with flour dusting his apron, noticed my intense gaze. "Anything I can help you with, son?" I stared at the meat, my stomach churning, my mouth watering. The new teeth throbbed with anticipation. I don't know, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. I'm so hungry." He chuckled. "We all get hungry sometimes." He was wrong. This wasn't just hunger. This was something else. Something dark and primal. I knew with a growing sense of dread that the raw chicken, the side of beef, it wouldn't be enough. The hunger would keep evolving, demanding more, and I, with my new teeth and ravenous appetite, would be forced to feed it. I just didn't know what it would want next, and that, more than the sharp teeth or the unending hunger, terrified me the most. The teeth were a symptom, not the disease. The real horror was the thing inside me, growing stronger with every bite, driving me towards something I couldn't even comprehend, but knew, with chilling certainty, was waiting in the shadows. And there we vanish, into the static of the storm. If you're still here, congratulations. You've survived this chapter of the night. But the void is patient. Ring the bell so the next horror never catches you unprepared. Tell us below, which story clawed deepest into your fears? Share this video with someone who claims they've seen it all. Then watch their bravado unravel. Until our next haunting, keep one eye on the shadows. The rain remembers your name.